Now this module is designed to cover the domain that is called the process of auditing information systems. Now this module is going to focus on the process of auditing your information systems to make sure that you're covering the entire practice of IS auditing. That would be all the procedures, making sure you have a thorough methodology designed to let the auditing team be able to perform an audit on any given IT area and do so in a professional manner. Now the objective of this particular domain, this module, is to ensure that you have the knowledge necessary to provide these audit services that are in accordance with the IT audit standards and designed to assist the organization with protecting and controlling their information systems. Now there are several tasks that we're going to see as we go through this module. Number one, you're going to work at learning how to develop and implement a risk-based IT audit strategy, one that's in compliance with the IT audit standards to cover all of the key areas. The second one is you're going to be able to plan specific audits to determine whether the information systems are protected, controlled, and to be able to provide value to the organization through the use of this audit. We also want to make sure that we can conduct audits in accordance with the IT audit standards to achieve planned objectives, and to report audit findings and make recommendations to the key stakeholders. And finally, we want to be able to see how to conduct follow-ups and prepare the status reports to ensure that the appropriate actions have been taken by management in a timely manner. Now, what's important to know is we're not going to tell you step by step every single thing you should go through in the process of auditing, but rather we are creating a framework and guidelines. It's actually a series of guidelines, standards, and procedures that you can follow and use to be able to implement your audit plan that's going to be in accordance to whatever contract you have with the organization that you're doing the audit on. This lesson is designed to talk about management's role of the audit function. Now, if you think about management, I am talking about management of the auditing team, not necessarily the upper management of the organization that's being audited. Now, when we look at it from the management perspective, the auditing should be managed and led in a manner that makes sure that all of the tasks that you are chartered to do are performed and accomplished by that audit team. In fact, management should make sure the auditors maintain independence during this function, as well as maintaining their competence in the auditing process. Now, we'll talk later about them having the competence in what they are auditing, but right now it's important that they understand really what is involved in conducting an actual audit. And as those guidelines and procedures change, they need to be up to date in their competence about that process. The audit function should have something that's value added as a contribution that the senior management can use. In other words, senior management needs this information to be able to, number one, understand where risks are and what they might be able to do to mitigate some of their risks, or to have an assurance that the controls they have in place are doing the job that they're supposed to do. And a lot of this goes to some high-level types of certifications to maintain laws and regulations. So yeah, there's a lot of value added contributions that senior management will get as a result of the audit. And of course, the audit function should also achieve the business objectives. And again, those objectives I talked about could be to maintain certain types of regulatory laws or certifications that are required by the company to do their business. Now, when we look at the organization of the IS audit function, we know that the audit services can be what we call external or internal. Now, internal means that the audit should be established by a contractor charter and have the approval of senior management. Now, this can be an internal audit. It can function as an independent group. And remember, that is important. The auditors should function independently as they're going through this process. The audit committee integrated within a financial and operational audit can provide IT-related control assurance to the financial or management auditors. So those are types of internal based audit services. Now, the external types would be audit services that are provided by an outside firm, meaning not people that are employed by the company. Now, the scope and objectives of these services should be listed in some very formal contracts between the organization and the external auditing team. In fact, I like to tell people that when they go in to do these auditings, depending on what they're doing, this contract and these permissions that they have, these agreements that we have that say what we can do, are their get out of jail free cards. Because if you think about it, as you're going through some of the auditing requirements, you might find weaknesses, and in the attempt to test those weaknesses, may come across information that might be of kind of high-level, top-secret information that the organization doesn't want to get out. And if you were just kind of doing your audit and you said, ooh, let's check on this control over here, and you go after and check on something that you're not under contract to even be looking at, that's where you have problems, right? So it's kind of, the fine line between auditing sometimes, and some people might think of hacking into systems, right? It's important that you remember to keep in accordance with your contract, and it should very specifically spell out what it is that you're auditing, and that's part of that agreement that we have, especially with an external firm. Now, whether we're doing either internal or external auditing, there should be an independence of that auditing team. As I talked about, we don't want them to necessarily, I guess I look at it this way. In auditing, let's say a bank type of a situation, if I'm working for the bank manager and the results of my auditing could embarrass that bank manager, there might be some sort of pressure on me from the person responsible for my job to keep some of that information quiet and secret. And I don't want that kind of pressure. I want to make sure there is true independence, so that when I go in there, I'm doing an objective job, knowing that the results, I'm going to report on them fairly and honestly, accurately, and not have to worry about the potential of another person putting that undue influence to kind of hide things or to sugarcoat the results. So we want that true independence, and we can achieve that internally. It's just a matter of who we select as a part of our team. Anyway, we know that they should be independent, and of course their goal is to report to the higher levels of management. Now, one of the things we have to look at in managing audits is our resource management. Now, technology changes, and it's important that as management, we ensure that the auditors are up to date with their skill sets. I kind of hinted at that already. That means that there's going to be required training that should be directed to new auditing techniques and training into their updates of the knowledge of technology. The CISA, which I'm just going to pronounce it the 𝗧𝗲𝗃, standards require that the auditing team be technically competent in what they do. And that makes sense to me, right? Because how can I adequately audit something I have no clue how it operates? And so we want to make sure we actually know what it is that we're auditing as far as the technology, so that we can adequately be able to say if it's functioning the way it should. Now, management should consider the auditor's skills and knowledge when they plan the audit. In other words, you need to know what that person's capable of doing so that you can plan to put them in the right location to do the right part of the auditing plan. Now, when we talk about audit planning, we have to look at that it has both short and long-term goals. Now, your short-term goals should take into account the issues that are going to be covered, say, throughout the next year. Now, your long-term auditing goals are going to take into account issues that are going to regard about changes to the organization's IT strategic direction. And we see this happening all the time, especially when we're looking at future purchases or future needs as far as what the IT organization part of the organization might be needing. There may be a plan to bring in a whole new vendor's worth of equipment, new firewall capabilities, new voice over IP, or something that we're seeing is going to be in the long-term effect. So that's kind of where we're looking at beyond the current year at the short-term level. All right, both your long and short-term issues should be reviewed at least annually to make sure that what your audit planning had at the time you created these short-term and long-term plans, that they still match the direction that the business is going. Some of the other planning considerations, of course, would be to do periodic risk assessments. And again, we're talking about the planning of when to do the audits. You should have plans in place to do the audits if you have a change in technology. Again, that could be maybe bringing in a new vendor firewall or upgrading to the latest and greatest Windows Server technology. When that happens, right, we're going to have changes in or have plans to do audits to make sure that these changes in technology are meeting whatever our standards are. Of course, laws change, regulatory requirements, new ones might be coming out, changes to existing ones. I remember when I first saw HIPAA, it was contained within one binder as far as when we talked about privacy issues for patients. And now it's like 3 or 4 binders in size. And so as those requirements change, we should have plans to do audits to make sure that we are staying within those requirements. And of course, there might be, like I said, new system implementations or upgrades that we're going to work with, future technologies that we might not even know about right now when we're making our plans for auditing. So that means that we have kind of this idea that as we see new technologies coming in, we're going to have plans to include those into our audits. And we need to also plan around our resource limitations. And again, some of the resources, if we look at the auditors themselves as our resource, they might not have the training they need for these new technologies or these changes. And so we want to plan for that as well, so that we can make sure when we're ready to do the audit that we have the resources available, or if we have to look at an external type of resource to be able to perform these audits. Part of your audit planning should be about the information gathering. Now, what do we need? Well, first of all, we need information about the environment that we're auditing. I just don't want to walk in blind to an organization and start poking around at different things saying, oh, well, I wonder what this does. I wonder what this is doing. I want to know how it all works. At least I don't need to have the in-depth, complete design, but I have to have a good understanding of the environment. As an example, I worked with a bank that has several data centers across the country. And it's important for me to understand how they are related to each other. What was the purpose of all the data centers? Obviously, it was for high availability, that if they had one in the Midwest, one in the Southwest, and one in the West Coast. And their goals, of course, were to be able to survive anything going wrong with one city, complete devastation of a building through fire or natural disaster. I mean, they wanted to have enough distance so they weren't even on the same power grids. So if I walk in to start an audit, it'd be kind of good if I had that understanding of that big environment, so I understood how they all work together. I also want to make sure we know and gather the information about the business practices and the functions that are relating to the audit. We should have the information, the documentation on the type of information systems and technologies that are used to support the business, as well as all of the regulatory requirements that are covering that particular business. Now, when we look at the ISACA's IS auditing standards, they do require that the auditor address the audit objectives and to comply with professional auditing standards. That is kind of what we're about here, is to make sure that we have standards in place so that we are able to conduct these professional audits rather than, just taking a guess or a stab at what I think I should be looking at. Now, the auditor should have basically a plan that considers the objectives of the organization and see how those are relevant to what's being audited in the technology infrastructure. That plan should include an understanding of the organization's IT architecture and their technological direction that they're going to go. Again, going back to looking at the future, what is the ideas that they have as far as where they see their business in a year, in a couple of years, and which direction are they going. So that's part of what I talked about with the information gathering. We use that information as a foundation for the actual audit planning. Now, the guidelines that we use, that an IS auditor should follow, are things like reviewing the background information, such as industry publications or annual reports. They should look at prior audit reports to see what issues were brought up in the audits that were done before this one. Understanding the business and IT long-term plans is a very important part of this. We need to remember that IT and IS is not the center of the business. We're there to support the business. If this business makes widgets, the purpose of IT and IS is to help support that business to make widgets, because that's how they make their money. And so we need to make sure we understand what the business needs are and what those long-term plans are. That means we should be talking with managers to learn about the business issues. We should be researching the specific regulations that apply. Every organization has some type of regulation or certification that would cover the type of business that they're in. Obviously, we heard of regulations such as Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA and many of those. So it's important that you understand what those regulations are, how they apply to that organization, because that's a part of what your goal is, or your plan for the audit, is to make sure that you're within those regulations. You should know if any of the IT functions are outsourced. For instance, it's not uncommon for some companies, especially smaller ones, to have an outsourced web presence or outsourced email types of presences. You know, what else is outsourced? Do they have contractors, consultants that come in to do specific high-end types of implementations of maybe third-party applications that they've bought and purchased and are using in that company? You should have generally, you know, as a guideline, a walk through the entire facility of the organization. It's kind of like the idea of having the plans about how the entire organization is laid out and how it is functioning. Now, as a part of what we look at in the management and the planning process of our auditing, we have to remember that there are those laws and regulations that are going to apply to almost every organization. And you know, they could be in compliance to government rules or maybe other external requirements, maybe contracts they have with some of their other, you know, not competitors, but companies that they're working with. As an example, I know that one company that did credit card processing, you know, they manage the little boxes where you swipe your cards. Every time they go to you know, another bank and say, we'd like to be able to process your cards, they would go through an audit to make sure that the credit card processing met the level and requirements of that are that bank's responsibility. The bank would say, okay, we have this type of regulation, we have these requirements of security, and if we're going to work together, you need to be able to meet those standards. And so it could be, like I said, external requirements, something that's related to the computer system practices. Now, a lot of these, as you look at these different regulations, often are going to include information about how data should be processed, transmitted, and stored. Even duration of storage. In some organizations, they're required to keep email for at least 7 years. Special considerations should be given on the issues for the highly regulated industries. These considerations should include all of the countries in which the organization operates. Now, that's an important statement. Imagine if you're an internet service provider and you, of course, have laws and regulations you have to follow as an ISP within the United States. But if you also are working with customers in other countries, you have to also make sure you're in compliance with their set of laws and regulations. And when you consider how many countries are still in the developing stages, especially in catching up in the internet technology, those are things that could be constantly undergoing change. So you need to make sure that you are, again, back to something I said already, knowledgeable about the laws and regulations, that you have those skills, that understanding is a part of the information gathering, and you use it in the audit planning. All right, what are some of the other effects of the laws and regulations? Well, privacy issues. As an auditor, you need to take into account any of the requirements of privacy laws and regulations. As an example, the safe harbor in Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, what they call the OECD. And by the way, there's a lot of alphabet soup throughout the auditing process, right? Lots and lots of acronyms. Anyway, they have the guidelines that govern privacy and trans-border flows of personal data. So again, we need to understand what those regulations are, how they apply to that organization, if at all. Now, some of the regulations that you should consider could be things like the establishment and organization of regulatory requirements, the responsibilities that are assigned to the organizations, any financial, operational, and other IT audit functions that would fall underneath those regulations. Now, there are two major areas of concerns when we're talking about these regulations. One, of course, is the legal requirements for us, the people doing the auditing, the auditors. There are laws and regulations and contractual agreements that we have to follow under. There's also legal requirements for the auditee. That would be requirements for their systems, as we said, their data management, reporting. And those two areas are going to impact the scope and objectives of the audit. Again, if you think about examples, Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA are perfect examples of regulations that do affect how we are going to conduct the audit and the requirements that the auditee has to undertake. Now, we can look at some steps that you should follow as the IS auditor to determine the organization's level of compliance. One of them is identification of requirements that are dealing with things like electronic data, like personal information, copyrights and e-commerce information, computer system practices and controls, and how they store information. You should also be looking at the documentation of the applicable laws and regulations, determining if the organization is planned to support those regulatory requirements, make sure you know if the organization has addressed any adherence to the applicable laws, and if there are established procedures that they use to follow those requirements. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the 𝗧𝗏's IT Audit and Assurance Standards and Guidelines. Now remember, we're not going to tell you, first click here. I mean, it's not to that level of detail. But we're going to talk about those guidelines and standards that you should be looking at and applying to the actual audit. First of all is the Code of Professional Ethics. And of course, it's important. We need to make sure as professionals, especially if our certification is with the CISA, that we understand what they're going to hold us accountable to as far as the way in which we act professionally. So I'm going to go over those with you. Number one of those is to support the implementation of and encourage compliance with the appropriate standards, procedures, and controls for information systems. And that is the goal, right? We want to make sure that that is the result of what we're looking at when we do the audit. We want to make sure that we are doing our duties with objectivity, to make sure we are putting in due diligence and professional care that are in accordance with professional standards and best practices. Sometimes you can read that as, don't take shortcuts. Especially if you decide to take those shortcuts and leave things out, or you aren't up to date on all of the regulations or laws or the technology that's being used, and you're not doing a very good job with it. If you don't know what the best practices are for a certain control or certain type of IS system, you know what? You're going to be in some violation of that due diligence and that due care or professional care, and that makes you liable if something bad happens to that organization through your basic lack of understanding or lack of care. So anyway, keep that in mind. Serving the interests of stakeholders in a lawful and honest manner while maintaining a high standard of conduct and character, and not to engage in acts that are discreditable to the profession. In other words, don't be a hacker on the side. As we continue on the discussion of these code of ethics, the next one is maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of information that's obtained in the course of your duties as the auditor, unless the disclosure of that information is required by legal authority. In that case, that information shall not be used for personal benefit at all, or released to inappropriate parties. Now, as you've heard me already using examples of some of the clients that I've had, I utilize terms like a bank or the hospital without telling you even what country it's in, or maybe if I do allude to it, I don't tell you specifically. The goal is I don't want to violate this rule, even in the aspect of training, by saying, oh, I worked for XYZ Bank over in, the New England area, and this is what happened. I mean, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want my clients to have this kind of information out there. Even if it's good or bad, it's their information. Only will disclose it to those people that I'm supposed to. And that's what you got to look at here as far as what they're trying to say with these code of ethics. The next one is maintain competency in your respective fields and agree to undertake only those activities that you can reasonably expect to complete with professional competence. Now, we talked about that already. As part of what management should be doing is making sure that the people in the audit team have that ongoing training they need to be able to do the adequate job, at least adequate job, of auditing certain areas. They have to be within their knowledge base. So that's important, right? I'm not going to go out there and audit something I don't know anything about. And I hate to say it, sometimes people will take on an auditing job because they want the money of the contract and figure they'll learn it as they go. To me, that doesn't ring true of this code of ethics with professional competence. So, and sometimes gives auditing a bad name. The next one is inform appropriate parties of the results of the work performed, reviewing all significant facts that are known to them. Again, that means don't, hide things. Don't sugarcoat the results, and don't succumb to any pressures that you might have to keep information you found secret. I mean, we can think of all sorts of really good thriller movies where that kind of thing was happening. All right, that's a movie. Here, our job is to be objective, to be independent, and to almost to quote Sergeant Joe Friday, which means I'm now aging myself. If none of you have ever heard of the TV show Dragnet, just the facts. We want to make sure we report them. All right, next one, of course, support professional education, because if we don't, support that professional education for the stakeholders and make sure that we can enhance their understanding of IS security and control, we're not doing them any benefits. We want to make sure that we do help the clients. Stakeholders, nice word, but the clients, the people we're auditing, we want to make sure they understand what is being reviewed and what we're auditing, so they understand how to use the controls appropriately, how to implement security appropriately, so that they can meet those levels or standards that they're seeking. IS auditing, along with the skills and knowledge necessary to perform an audit, have globally applicable standards that you'll find in the ISACA's body of knowledge. And that is kind of the idea. Again, we're not going to tell you every little thing you need to do, but we are going to give you the appropriate standards and guidelines and procedures that you would follow. And some of them seem kind of high level, but again, they're globally applicable so that you can utilize these as your foundation for your audit, regardless of the actual type of organization that you're going to be auditing. The goal then is to advance the standards to be able to meet those needs. Now, as we talk about these standards, I'm going to kind of just give you the standards that ISACA has for the IT audit assurance. And they are to inform. They are to inform the IS auditors of the minimum acceptable performance. These objectives and standards are designed to inform management of the expectations concerning the work of the audit practitioner, to inform the members that they should be aware of the requirements and that failing to comply with these standards could result in an investigation into their conduct by the ISACA. Now, the framework for the ISACA IT audit and assurance standards have several following levels, and of course, it's almost like we're working out the wording of a contract here, right? But we're building a foundation here of the terms, and the basis of everything we're going to see here in the next section is that they're going to be following the definitions of standards, guidelines, and procedures. Now, standards, those are going to be the mandatory requirements for IT audit and assurance reporting. Guidelines are just that. They provide guidance for applying audit and assurance standards. Now remember, guidelines do take into account some professional judgment of how they are applied. That's why it's called a guideline. I'm not going to tell you every little step you need to do. That's your judgment to see how you should conduct the audit, but you have guidelines to help give you some general direction of where you want to go. And procedures are examples of the process that an auditor might follow. Procedures often provide information on how to meet the standards, but they are not by themselves standards. They do not set requirements. They are just steps you can follow to get to those specific standards. Now, as we talk about auditing standards, we're going to kind of hit all of these different standards that are defined by the ISACA. The first is the audit charter. Okay, that's your contract. This is the purpose, responsibility, authority, and accountability of the IS function. In other words, the contract, the charter is saying, why are you doing the audit? Who's responsible? Who has the authority and accountability of this function? Right? We're going to outline all of the basic roles of not only those who are doing the audit, but what's expected of those who are being audited. Independence. That includes professional independence in all matters related to the audit. And organizational independence in that the audit function should be independent of what's being audited. Again, I use the example that, if I was an internal employee and I'm doing an audit of a bank, but the bank manager over me knows that something I found could be very embarrassing to him or her, that might be undue influence that they could cause me, like little subtle hints about my job and remaining employed. I should be able to do an audit being independent of those things being audited. Another good reason to have a contract. because regardless of whether they like the information or not, as long as I'm professional, I am accurate, and I'm competent, the goal is to make them better. And sometimes you have that political pressure. Well, when I'm contracted, I'm going to get paid either way, hopefully. That kind of helps me in my independence as well, because I know that I'm there to do a job. Anyway, that's all it's trying to say is we should not have that undue pressure. Professional ethics and standards. The auditor should adhere to the ISACA's Code of Professional Ethics that I've just talked about. Some of the other standards are things like professional competence. Now, I know we've already hit a lot of these, and you're thinking, man, you've already talked about these. Yes, we have. But we're putting them into the perspective of the standards, guidelines, and procedures and where they fall. And professional competence is another standard. The auditor should maintain their skills and knowledge to be able to professionally conduct the audit assignments. In other words, if I have somebody who's really good with Windows operating systems and knows nothing about Cisco routing and switching, I'm not going to put them into that audit position of something they don't know. I want to use their skills and knowledge professionally and make sure that they have the skills and knowledge updated for the areas that they are assigned. Another standard is planning. The auditor should plan the manner in which the audit will be performed to be able to make sure you cover all of the audit objectives as well as any applicable laws. And those plans should document in detail the nature and objectives of the audits, as well as the timing, right? When it's going to happen and what resources are required to make this happen. Another standard covers the performance of audit work. Now, this can be divided into 3 areas. The first is supervision. That's where the audit staff should be supervised to make sure that they are finding and getting to the objectives and that they are accomplishing the objectives of the audit. That's, first line management. Next is evidence. This talks about where the auditor should be able to provide reliable and relevant evidence to document their findings. And it reminds me of a story of a person I was talking to who was a part of an audit team for a bank. And during their process of auditing, they found that a person who was able to log in at the level of a mail clerk had the ability, if they knew how to do it, to be able to go out and write letters of credit. And as a part of his evidence, he did that. He logged on with that clerk, wrote the letter of credit for $2 million and printed it out, and that was part of the evidence. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go to that extreme, because I kind of question that whole process, because I'm thinking the financial part of this now suddenly has a $2 million letter of credit they got to account for, and so it wouldn't be something I would have done. Maybe a screenshot of being at that location, that screen, and able to do it. Anyway, that's examples of evidence anyway, and we use that to help document the findings. Now, the documentation merely suggests that the audit process should be recorded, listing the work and the evidence to be able to support findings and conclusions. And by the way, that's a very important process, because it's one thing, and I know this happens in the industry. I haven't seen it happen. Well, maybe to some extent. I'm thinking of another bank. They contacted me to learn more about the auditing process because they had hired a firm who charged them a flat fee plus a certain fee per IP address of what was being audited. It turned out to be a very large amount of money. And all they did was run a little program called 𝗪𝗔𝗍 that did some automatic checks against all these different systems on the network, and then just printed these default things out, and that was their findings and conclusions. In a way, it did support the work that was done, as opposed to they could have just said, oh, I checked and everything's fine. That makes me think, did you do the work? How do I know you did the work if you can't show me any evidence, right? Support to be able to show your findings and conclusions. So it's important that we have it. It's a part of the evidence. And we'll get to talk a little bit more about evidence as we go on. Now, one of the standards for reporting describes the appropriate forms that should be completed at the end of the audit. This report usually will restate the scope, the objectives, the time that the audit occurred, and what work was performed. Now, the reports should state the findings, the conclusions, and recommendations of the audit team, and they should also contain the evidence needed to support results. And guess what? We're talking about these as overviews, and we'll have the chance to talk in more detail about reports as well. Some of the other standards, of course, would be your follow-up activities that would be the reporting of recommendations to the organization for the purpose of bringing them into compliance. Sometimes we might even call that remediation. Basically, we're saying, this is what we found that's not in compliance. Here's our recommendations of what you can do. And the reason that's important is because we're leaving it up to the management to choose which of the recommendations they want to follow. Anyway, again, part of reporting, we're going to get a chance to talk more about that. Standards about the irregularities and illegal acts, which should be a part of the reporting and part of the finished body of work. Now, what does that mean? That means that we might have located perhaps areas of fraud through the use of our auditing, or things that people are doing illegally. And we need to report those things. Even if you might say, you know, that's going to cause Fred over here a lot of angst. They might even get to go to jail because of what I found. You know, that's, and I hate to sound callous, but that's your job. If you find those irregularities or illegal acts, you need to make sure that's a part of the report. Regardless of how you feel about the person that might affect, it is not your job to be the judge and the jury, just to report what you found. Let somebody else, if they need to, get further into that investigation. And I know I'm going off on all these ideas that we're going to get to talk about you know, in a little bit more detail as we go on. Anyway, so the standards. So now what that means is, how do we look at these? Well, as an auditor, we should always be skeptical during the audit, knowing that there are going to be some irregularities or even illegal acts, that they could exist, and there may even be attempts by people to hide those acts from you while you're doing the audit. If those acts are found, you should make sure you have the sufficient evidence to be able to support your finding. But then again, that's true of any of the facts that you bring into your report. You should have evidence to support that. Now, IT governance is a process where the auditor can assess if the IS function is in alignment with the organization's mission, its vision, its values, objectives, and strategies. Now, the auditor should determine whether the IS function is a clear statement about the performance expectations. Part of governance is that the review and assessment of how effective the IS resources and performance management processes are running. We should be looking, the audit should be looking and reviewing, able to assess the compliance with legal, environmental, and information quality, as well as any fiduciary and security requirements. The audit should be done in a risk-based approach, and we'll talk about what that means, risk-based, later on, but it should be done in that approach, which can include those risks that could adversely affect the IS environment. Now, you might notice as I every now and then keep saying, we'll talk more about. Again, we're laying the foundation here about what these standards are. And we, you know, as a standard, we may mention something that we certainly are going to get into more detail about later. I just want to make sure you understand that we will talk about that. So when you hear me say risk-based approach, and you say, well, what is the risk-based approach? I don't understand how the standard works if I don't know what this is. We're building the foundation of what the standard is, and we're going to, you know, kind of help continue to build on it as we go through. Part of the standards, again, is that the use of risk assessment and audit planning involves the appropriate assessment techniques or approach that's used in developing the audit plan. The process should determine the priorities for the effective allocation of your IS audit resources. Now remember, those resources are often the people doing the audit. The audit materiality should be considered with the relationship to the audit risk. This is useful for determining the nature and timing that you're going to use for the audit. It also can help you determine the extent of the audit procedures. When planning for the audit, the auditor should consider potential weaknesses or absence of controls, and if these could result in efficiency or material weaknesses in the information systems. Again, part of the materiality, some of the weaknesses could be considered minor control deficiencies that the auditor should consider the overall effect of these deficiencies could have in information systems. Now, let me think of it, try to word that in a little different way, because I'm giving you the standard. The idea is, you might say, oh, I found a deficiency, but it's pretty minor. And you might say, in fact, so minor, maybe not worthy of an extra footnote. But if I find 10, 15, 20 minor deficiencies, as a whole, could they really open up a major problem for this particular organization? The answer is probably that they could. So even though you find a minor deficiency, we need to know how that's going to be looked at as a whole with all of those minor deficiencies. It's, it just goes back to the fact that your strength of your systems, is as good as your weakest link many times. So just make sure you have that whole picture as you're doing this audit. And of course, these deficiencies, even if they're minor, they should be included in the report. You might be using the work of other experts, and if it's been done, you should consider that information where appropriate for your audit. Now, the outside work should be assessed and determined if it meets special qualifications and competencies. Again, just because somebody hands me a report, says this is what these other folks did, I still want to know, did the people that created the report have what it takes to be able to do the audit? In any event, the outside work should be a part of the review and evaluation process. The audit process should determine if the outside work is adequate and complete, and the results of that review that you make of that outside work should also be clearly documented. Now, your audit evidence, as I mentioned before, should be sufficient and appropriate to support the audit conclusions. Your IT controls should be evaluated and monitored, especially if they're an integral part of the internal control environment of this organization. Now, the auditor can help assist management by giving some advice to the regards of the design or the use of the controls. And that's kind of our idea, right? That's a part of our recommendations. We should be able to say, here's things you could do to improve the controls, or maybe other ways in which you could use it, or even make recommendations for new ones. E-commerce should be evaluated along with any applicable controls. Risk assessment should be used when you're reviewing the e-commerce environment to make sure that those transactions are properly controlled. Now, that's an important aspect, right? Because e-commerce, we're talking about money being exchanged, especially from other customers, other people that it could affect. And so again, that risk assessment type of approach should be done not only throughout most of the audit, but especially in the e-commerce environment. Now, as we're going through building our foundation, and we've talked about standards, the next thing to do is to talk about guidelines. Now, there are a number of different guidelines that you'll see referenced through the ISACA's list of guidelines and even the effective date of when those guidelines took place. And again, that's all they are. They're trying to help you get a way to go through the audit process using your professional experience, following a guideline to have kind of as your, I hate to keep using the same word, but as your guidance to the finished end product of this audit. One of the first guidelines that we see is called Using the Work of Other Auditors, which was effective March 1st of 2008. What that does, and we've talked about it a little bit already, is addresses how you should go around the process of using other people's work, other experts that are in the audit field. And especially if there are any constraints that could impair the audit work that need to be performed, you might be able to utilize some of this outside work. Now, you might consider outside work having an expert from maybe the next firm perform aspects of the audit where the nature of the audit is maybe highly technical, or the audit team you don't have enough resources, you don't have enough people, or people with the knowledge they need in the specific areas. And that's something that to be considered, because in the IS field, there are a lot of vendors, a lot of technologies, some very, I want to say unique. They're very highly technical and maybe not utilized by a large number of people because of the type of application or the type of device that it is. So it's not unusual for you to have to go get that outside help. One of the other guidelines is about the audit evidence requirement that was effective May 1st of 2008. And the guideline covers how the auditor should be able to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence and draw reasonable conclusions based on those audit results. Now, again, the use of evidence is important because without it, with it, to me, it's kind of what supports my billables, right? I'm coming up with a conclusion. People are going to say, well, how did you get there? And I just don't want to pull things out of thin air. I want to say, well, here, this is what I found. Here's my evidence. And from this evidence, this is the conclusions that I was able to draw. So again, a guideline to help you about what is considered sufficient and appropriate. The other one, the CAT, the use of computer-assisted audit techniques. Now, you might need some tools to be able to record, transact, and process data that comes from an audit, especially when you think about the sheer amount of information that you might be looking at. And that's what these tools do. They help us do what we humanly can't do, which is to be able to sift through large amounts of information. So these tools can lead to an increased audit coverage, as well as being more thorough and more consistent in analyzing the data. And the tools could have some sort of specific audit software that you're using. It might be something you've created a customized script to be able to go out and gather information, or any other type of software technique that's involved in just that gathering information, things that are a lot easier to do through that automation than you would be able to do by manually trying to review all of the information. Now, outsourcing of IS activities to other organizations, another guideline, effective May 1st, 2008. The organization that you're working with might partially or fully outsource some of their IS activities to a third party. Now, that third party could be a group of people that are on-site or off-site. As an example, I've been to many organizations where, and I'm trying to be very vague so I don't say specifically companies and names, but here's the situation. This company needed new hardware for the infrastructure and they just couldn't afford it. But what they found out is that there was a firm whose job was to specifically buy your IT department. They would buy the contract to run it, meaning that all of your existing employees would suddenly become employees for this new company, but they'd still work at your facility. And with that, they were able to infuse the money to be able to buy new equipment. And so over a long period, I guess you could say you are paying a little bit more for the people you used to employ, but that was also helping pay for the new upgrades or the new equipment that you wanted to have. And so there's an example, technically, that these people are third party to the organization, but they certainly were on site. And of course, off-site might very well just be having a consulting firm that comes in to do updates or repairs or whatever that you might be using. Anyway, so again, guidelines, that's what we're talking about, guidelines of the process of doing these audits. Now, the auditor is going to be responsible to make sure that you confirm the compliance of those third-party resources, but it has to still be within your existing contract agreements that you have with the organization, and maybe you may have to also have contracts and agreements with a third party, so you have the rights to be able to conduct that audit. So anyway, you need to know what your rights are to be able to audit a third party when technically it's a different one that hired you. Next one is the audit charter. Remember, charter is another nice word for contract. Guidelines for that on effective February 1st, 2008. It was designed to help the auditors to be able to prepare a charter or contract that would define their responsibilities, their authority, and accountability. A very important process, right? A lot of legalese that we need to go through to make sure that you're not in any violations of any type of regulations or other laws, and also to give you that, basically to give you that authority and responsibility to conduct those audits. A lot of times you have to almost call rank on somebody to say, look, I need to perform this audit, and they say, we're busy, we're not going to let you have access, whatever the reason is. And you can simply say, look, I've got the authority, the accountability, the responsibility. I've got it here in writing. It comes from people on the very high end of management. That's just kind of the idea, is that you want to make sure that your charter and contract gives you some of those responsibilities that you're looking for, or the authority that you need to do the audit. Materiality concepts for auditing information, effective May 1st, 2008. So what constitutes materiality? All right, so let's think of it this way. If I was doing a financial audit, I can measure the materiality in monetary terms. I mean, I can sit there and say, I have this much cash in, I have this much cash out. I mean, we have numbers I can use. I can say, look, this is what we're doing financially. When it comes into the information systems, that's not quite as a tangible thing that I can get. And so you can use this guideline to help you determine how materiality should be assessed. So, if we're trying to do evaluations of or valuations, of the controls, like physical access controls and logical access controls and change control systems and other types of controls, it's hard to put a finger on it. I mean, let's just say that I'm going to talk about a control that is trying to safeguard data in your database, whatever that data might be. And what's that worth to you? Let's say it's your customer accounts. What's that worth to you? I mean, there's the cost, of course, of the valuation of replacing or repairing the information. But then we have to worry about the customer's reactions, especially if their information was used maybe in identity thefts. I know I'm kind of just going right out there and saying, giving you examples of what I'm saying. It's hard to put some value on some of these controls, what it really means to you when you're trying to decide, what is it going to cost my reputation? What is it going to cost me to make my customers whole? Did it affect my customers? Are they going to be customers in the future? What's it going to cost just to recreate the information that was destroyed or altered, or all of those things? And so, like I said, it's a little harder to come up with some of those values. Next guidelines under due professional care, effective March 8th, 2008. Now, this guideline clarified the term due professional care as it applies to the performance of doing an audit. Basically, the guideline is there to assist you in applying your IT and audit assurance standards, as well as making sure you comply with the ISACA's Code of Professional Ethics. Again, going back to the terms that we talked about before, some due diligence, in this case, the due professional care. Guideline for audit documentation, effective March 1st, 2008. The guideline describes the documentation that you should prepare and retain in support of your audit findings. Now, this report can determine how to achieve the implementation of standards, guidelines talking about how you should use your professional judgment in its application, as well as being able to justify any departure you might have taken from existing standards. Oh, by the way, that is something that can happen, right? We could sometimes make recommendations that don't look like best practice or existing standards, completely within the realm to make those suggestions. But when you do go away from standards or sometimes best practices, you need to be able to justify why that was done, so that if anything ever occurred and somebody says, oh, you're liable because you didn't follow this best practice, you can say, well, hold on, time out. We looked at it, we analyzed it, we audited it, and these are the reasons why we departed from it. Again, just guidelines about your documentation. Another one of the guidelines is the audit considerations for irregularities, again effective September 1st, 2008. Of course, again, these were guidelines that helped provide the auditor with a means for understanding what they should be looking at should they come across any type of irregularities or illegal acts that are happening as the course of their audit. Again, it's guidelines for considerations on reporting and handling those things. Another guideline for audit sampling, effective August 1st, 2008, provides guidelines for what might be an effective sample of information that you're auditing. How much of it, how you should come about getting the information, what you should be looking for. And remember, sampling is one of those things we do when we are confronted with a large amount of information. We know we can't just look at all of it, but we can take little pieces of it and try to glean what it's all like based on those samples. And so it's guidelines about how to go through conducting that type of an audit. Effect of pervasive IS controls. This was effective August 1st, 2008. Now, of course, this means that we're looking at ways to, guidelines of how to evaluate controls, and not only controls, but even of management's use of or monitoring of these controls. So as you're thinking about putting your audit together, I'm hoping you're seeing that these guidelines are designed in helping you come up with an effective and hopefully a professional way at going through and doing these audits, so that you can basically justify a lot of the techniques that you might choose to use based on the guidelines that you're seeing here. Another one of the guidelines is under the category of organizational relationship and independence. Now, this was effective August 1st, 2008. And what we're saying here, of course, is that we need to look at the management structure and the ability of me as an auditor to be truly independent through this auditing process. And so that's kind of where we're looking at the management and the authority that they have over the people doing the independent auditing, and whether or not there's any breakdown there that we have to deal with that's causing us to maybe not have the independence that we need. Again, guidelines for how you might deal with that, or to report it or to work with it. Use of risk assessment and audit planning. All right, again, here effective August 1st, 2008. Now, there is some things you have to think about when it comes to risk assessment. That's can be used in a lot of different areas. We're talking about the risk assessment and audit planning. So what are we really saying? Well, there is a risk in doing audits. Now, this isn't saying risk assessment of a database, but going with your audits. In other words, if you're not thorough with your auditing, if your plan didn't show the type of thoroughness that you need and you missed information, or you didn't gather enough information to come up with the right conclusions, there is some risk associated with those bad conclusions. And so these are guidelines for hopefully helping you avoid that type of situation. Application Systems Review, effective October 1st, 2008. And as it sounds, of course, here we're talking about applications that are running and the controls that we use to protect them. So again, guidelines about ways in which you can look at the plan for how you're going to do an audit of an application, of course, depending on how it's being used by the organization and of the controls that are working with this application. We have guidelines to help you in the times when you might have to revise the planning. It's called Planning Revised. It was effective May 1st, 2010, and then that's what it's about, is to, during the course of your planned audit, if something has been discovered or found that may call for a revision in the plan, guidelines about how to go through that process. Effective third parties on organizations' IT controls, which is effective March 1st, 2009. Here the guidelines are going to talk about your involvement in doing the audit to reach certain, of course, the ISACA standards and COBIT, and being able to do evaluations of third parties that are working with the organization that you're auditing, and their effect based on your standards of the audit. The next one is the effect of non-audit role on the IS auditors. All right, so what's a non-audit role? A non-audit role is a person who's not a part of the auditing team. Generally, these are issues where we are talking about upper management, almost what I like to call C-levels, the CEOs, CIOs, CFOs, those types of folks. And of course, they have an effect on your job as an auditor. Your job is to stay independent, and they can have an effect that can take away some of that independence that you need. And so these are guidelines about how to deal with those situations and maybe ways to plan around those types of issues if they come up. The guideline on IT governance, effective May 1st, 2010, is just what it sounds like. It's your planning of how to go about doing the audit of those folks that are basically running the show. The Enterprise Resource Planning, ERP, is a process that we would go through in trying to, of course, look at ways in which we have the effective resources to be able to work with our auditing section. The next guideline is on the business to consumers e-commerce review, what they call the B2C. And of course, there are guidelines about the use of e-commerce when it comes from your organization and its customers or clients. Internet banking guidelines, effective August 1st, 2003, which are, again, ways of giving you guidance about the process of auditing those organizations that might have internet banking. The review of virtual private networks, effective July 1st, 2004. As it sounds, we're talking about generally the encrypted IPsec VPNs and ways of giving you guidelines about looking at their effectiveness of how they're being used for secure communications. Mobile computing, effective September 1st, 2004. Now, of course, think about when that was effective. Back then, mobile computing was mostly dealing with laptops. We didn't really have we had a PDA market, but we don't certainly have a lot of the same mobile computing we do now. But we can still use those guidelines in helping us in the process of doing the evaluations and audits. Post-implementation review, effective January 1st, 2005. So this kind of comes after the audit's been done, after your reports have been turned in, after your recommendations have been done, and guidelines about the process you would go through to basically review to see if some of those recommendations or if any of those recommendations have been implemented. General consideration on the use of the internet, effective March 1st, 2006. Okay, this is probably a very controversial area when it comes to doing a lot of auditing, which is just what it sounds like. What are the expectations of your organization, the rules that they set out, or any other guidelines that you need in determining what is acceptable or non-acceptable use of the internet from those people that are involved in the organization, at least while on the organization's property. Responsibility, authority, and accountability. These guidelines, again, are designed to help you in being able to plan and come up with the agreements about the responsibilities and the authorities and who you report to through the auditing process. Follow-up activities, effective March 1st, 2006, designed kind of like the post-implementation review, is a way of being able to review and be accountable for any activities that needed to be done after certain points of your audit. Biometrics controls. Okay, this one effective February 1st, 2007. Here we're getting into parts of authentication type of controls. Biometrics are going to be, fingerprints, iris scans, those types of things that we use for authentication. When we are reviewing them, there's a lot of information about biometrics. So again, guidelines to follow. And you might think of things like false positives and false negatives, and basically saying it authenticated somebody it shouldn't, or it didn't authenticate somebody that it should. This crossover error rate that they have. So again, guidelines about that process. Access controls. Okay, so access controls are, again, my means of getting access, whether directly, remotely, but a way of, again, guidelines of doing that evaluation process. One of the other guidelines we have is called IT organizations. That was effective May 1st, 2008. Now this one's tricky because every IT organization is going to be different. And it's there's not like a cookie cutter approach to what makes a good and effective IT organization. And so it's going to be difficult when you're going through the audit to really evaluate how effectively or efficiently the organization is running. At least by any other standard of, well, yesterday I was at this company, that's how they did business, you're doing it differently, I like that way, and that's not what this is about. It's about guidelines to help you achieve results through evaluations to help you determine if the structure that they are using, whatever that structure is, how well is it running efficiently and effectively. Review of security management practices. Okay, so here, this is a guideline of basically being able to look at the way in which the IT organization is currently conducting security, managing security, their practices, and whether or not those are sufficient or meeting whatever the objectives are. Return on security investment, effective May 1st, 2010, is a guideline in the evaluation of a control. In other words, if we're looking at auditing some of the controls, we have to ask ourselves, based on the cost of the control, the cost of operating it, training the people working with it, we need to find a way to be able to evaluate its effectiveness and how it's doing, so that we can report back whether it was a good investment, maybe too much of an investment, or whatever the case might be. Continuous assurance, another guideline that was active May 1st, 2010. Now, this is an ongoing process. It's a way of making recommendations, a guideline of the recommendations you make that a corporation or organization would use to continue to give them the assurance that controls are working the way they should after you're done and gone with the audit. Let's talk a little bit about the audit assurance tools and techniques. Now, the CISA developed standards that give you the examples of possible processes that you might want to follow. And the tools and techniques document are providing what we might call procedures, information on how to meet those standards during the audit. But because they're procedures, they don't set requirements. Now, these can be procedures about how you might go about doing an audit on databases, on firewalls, and so many different things. But that's all they are just methods to help you, or procedures that you might follow to help you get to that point to hit those standards that we are supposed to follow. Now, there is a relationship between the standards, guidelines, and tools and techniques. Notice how we took procedures out and call them tools and techniques. And it's important to remember that the standards that CISA puts out are designed to be followed by the auditor. The guidelines were merely ways of providing help to find ways to implement the standards, right? It was giving you a path that you might follow. And the tools and techniques, which is certainly not at all exhaustive, gives guidance for you as far as examples of some of the steps you might go through or follow to be able to do a specific type of an audit. So again, if you wanted to audit a firewall as one of the controls, and maybe you just really, what should I do? Should I run some sort of script? Should I look at access control lists or the security policies that they're being used? I mean, all of these are maybe a bit of a nightmare to people coming into audit the first time, and they're like, where do I start? Well, that's where the guidelines can help you on the path where you want to go. And the procedures, the tools and techniques can be examples for you to say, oh, okay, I see it. Look at these examples of things I can do. So maybe the tool and technique they give you an example of isn't appropriate, but you'll find something that is. And that's all it's designed, is to help you in this process of getting to those standards that we do have to follow. Now, the ITAF, which is the Information Technology Assurance Framework, is meant as a comprehensive good practice model. So what it does is it provides guidance on the design, conduct, and reporting of your IT audit. It can help you in defining the terms and concepts that are specific to IT assurance, and it establishes standards for the IT audit and assurance professional role and responsibilities. When we take a look at the ITAF, it is focused on the foundation of the ISACA material, as well as content from the IT Governance Institute. Now, when we take a look at what IATF gives you, it's going to talk about some general standards, performance standards, reporting standards, guidelines, tools and techniques. So again, right, it's standards, the things that we are trying to achieve or should achieve, guidelines on how to get there, and the tools and techniques. Now, under the standards, I did say that it had general standards, and those are the guiding principles under which the IT assurance profession operates. All right, so that kind of sounds like those code of ethics that we had with ISACA. Performance standards, these are going to deal with the conduct of the assignment, such as planning and supervision, risk and materiality. And that's, really the basis of what we're doing with the audit. And the end result is the reports, the reporting standards, describe the types of reports and other communications. Now, your guidelines are designed to provide the IT audit professional with information about the audit or the assurance areas. And again, like we talked about with the ISACA, the guidelines are there to help provide that path of that road. And the tools and techniques are there to provide information about the different types of methodologies or the tools and the templates that you might use. And there are a lot of tools and techniques out there in this world that you can use, some that are free and open, others that are, of course, from companies that are charging for the use of those tools. Lots of them out there that you might be able to use. In fact, just off the top of my head, as I think about these different types of tools and techniques, if I'm auditing maybe a Microsoft Windows platform, well, right away, Microsoft makes a free tool called the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. And its job is to analyze a system based on Microsoft best practices and tell you about the report, about where it's at. Right, so that's a tool that you might be able to use in getting to whatever it is that you're auditing. Obviously, at least for a Microsoft system in that example. So all of these are, again, not designed to be exhaustive, but to give you examples and help you on the way down through the audit to get to those standards. So let's take a little more look at the general standards for ITAF at section 2200. Now, giving you the section number so you can do more research if you want to get more information about any of these. The general standards are the guiding principles that the IT assurance profession operates in. And those standards include things like independence and objectivity. Now, suddenly you're thinking, wait a minute, you just got through talking about those. And I did, but we were under the heading of the ISACA standards. And remember that ITAF, I said, utilized those standards as its platform in developing its standards. So that means that general standards would include, as I said, the independence and objectivity for all the same reasons we did before, that it's important the auditors are independent of those areas in which they're auditing, and that they remain objective about what they're doing, no bias going in there. Reasonable expectations of what we expect from the auditor through their work. That management acknowledges what's happening, that they understand that the audits are going on and that they provide assistance as they need. About the auditor maintaining their training and proficiency in the work that they do, in the areas that they audit, that they have sufficient knowledge of the subject matter, that they provide due care, and that they have the suitable criteria needed to be able to make those types of audits that they're doing. Other parts of the general guidelines deal with objectivity. It's important that we've mentioned it twice now, right? Measurability, understandability, completeness, and relevance. Okay, so where are we going with those? Well, of course, objectivity makes sense to us, again, about doing our job effectively with no bias. That it can be measured in some method that we are able to look at it. I think, we talked a little bit about the materiality before, but, can I measure the objectives? Can I measure the work that they're doing? Is it understandable work that they're doing? Did they do it all the way through? Or do they just kind of go halfway and say, yeah, that's good enough? Looks, what's the old saying? And for those of you in government work, this is just a stupid saying, I know. But they always say, oh, good enough for government work, right? No, all right? They're never good enough for any type of work. Completeness needs to be there as part of the standards. Relevance as well. Especially when you start hearing me go off on stories. Sometimes you're going to be judging me on my relevance of what I'm trying to accomplish in relaying this information to you. But yes, relevance as to the test we did, the audits we did, are relevant to the area and to the control that we were evaluating, right? All of these are kind of important guidelines. Now the performance standards, which is section 2400, are your baseline expectations of the conduct that should be undertaken during an IT assurance contract. Now, some examples, again, of the criteria when it comes to planning and supervision. The objectives and criteria, are they well stated? Do we know what their goals are and what we're supposed to do? Do we have the appropriate levels of assurance that are needed or required? Have we found the appropriate sources of information and evidence? The availability of resources with the needed skill sets, making sure management-wise, right, the minimum baselines, that we're not putting unskilled, unknowledgeable people in over their head trying to do an audit of something they don't understand. So again, skill sets. Preliminary conclusions on assignment and audit risks. That's an important part of management. And I keep seeing these, I know that we're going to talk more about risk. And remember, we're building a foundation. So a lot of times you might be saying, again, there's that audit risk. All right, we're getting there. We're working our way into that. Right now, we're just putting it into these standards. And then as we fill in those pieces, you'll say, okay, now I really get it. But management is again, tasked not only with the planning, but, to look at the fact that there is a risk when we do audit and to be able to have preliminary information about that. What other minimum baselines? Resource and expertise requirements. Remember, resources often are referenced to the people doing the audit. The planning and timeline of the assurance tasks. Now, timeline is very important, by the way. Many times we have to find an appropriate time to do an audit of a certain control. And usually, depending on the goal and the objective, we don't want to interrupt business either. And so often we have to make sure that people know when we're going to do these, make sure that's approved, that it's a good time, and again, it's all part of the planning process. Making sure you have reasons why you might extend or modify the assurance worker's audit. And that could be from some irregularity you might not have expected to see. And it might, cause there to be a reason to extend or change the original plans. And of course, with any type of contract or charter, part of the minimum standards we expect is the establishment of time and cost budgets, right? No overruns unless it's justified as a part of reasons, like I said, to extend or modify. But that's why we have to have, these types of standards put into the performance of what we do. So that I just don't have people automatically getting the extra pay, the extra billable hours, and going over the cost budget. So, again, section 2400 to be able to look a little more detail if you need to about these performance standards. Now, the next part of your performance standards gets us into the area of obtaining sufficient evidence. So again, remember, we're looking at those minimum standards or baselines. So we should have, as a part of these, the audit procedures. They should be followed so that we can obtain the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence to use as our basis for conclusions. We should, as a part of our performance, when it comes to evidence, expect that there's documentation of the evidence that was obtained. because that needs to be able to be inspected. People want to be able to observe or see, to make inquiries and even confirm the work or the results that you came up with. We need to have documentation that all the evidence was considered to support the audit procedure. You know, I think back into the days of forensic evaluation of computer files, when we talk about the documentation of evidence. And it was very important that we remembered that when you're going through and digitally examining a hard drive, and you know what the caseworker's looking for, they're looking for evidence of some crime, and you find that evidence, well, of course, we document it, we report it. But it's, I think, also equally important, because we said it in forensics, and I'm saying it here as the example about evidence, that all evidence is considered. If you found evidence that disproved what the investigator is looking for, you don't hide it. You don't, disappoint them or ruin their day. I mean, eventually in forensics, we're talking about a person's livelihood. You report all the evidence, and so you want to document all the evidence, good or bad. And then, of course, now it sounds like you're not being objective, right? You just report all of it. You look at all of it in the consideration of what you're using for evidence to support your eventual results. And of course, you want to make sure that you have documentation of what tests were performed along with the test results. Now, as we're still talking about the performance standards, we also have assignment performance. Now, assignments must be scheduled with appropriate timing, availability, and as of course must be balanced against all of the other commitments and requirements that management has. And remember that whatever the assignment is, that it must be assigned within the skill set of the person that got that task assigned to them. So we want to be careful to make sure we're not putting the wrong resources in the wrong area. As we look at the rest of the performance standards, the last one are representations. Now, all received representations should be documented and retained by the IT assurance professional. And when people say, well, what does that mean? What's a representation? It means something that people have told you, right? This could include the statements that an auditor received that shows an acknowledgement of responsibilities in those processes being audited, or a statement by the people being audited, what we call the auditee, acknowledging responsibilities for the criteria. In other words, they represented to us that they acknowledged their responsibilities. And we want to record these things down. So we basically have notes that are covering all of these aspects of communications. You should also include all contradicting assertions that have been disclosed, and statements and other communications from regulators, if you have them, and basically any other matter that you, the auditor, might think is relevant or appropriate to the audit at hand. All of those representations, like I said, they should be recorded when they're received and documented. Now, the reporting standards will reflect the types of assignments that was performed by the auditor or by the assurance person or professional. And the reporting standards should address, of course, the types of reports that we're going to have, the means in which they are communicated, and of course what information is going to be communicated through the reporting standards. Now, at a minimum, your reporting standards should include some of the following things. The obvious stuff: to whom the report is directed, as well as the nature and the objectives of the assignment. That's kind of like the big intro, right? You know, to whom it may concern. This is my last will and test. No, this is, what we were doing. This is the objectives of the audits and the assignments that we had. That means that we also need to talk about, in general, what's covered by the IT assurance report. There should be a confirmation of the subject matter or assertions that are being reported, a review of the nature of the scope of work, the time frame in which this review took place, references to any of the applicable professional standards, and any management assertions. Again, remember we said we were going to keep those assertions and record them and use them. Other things that should be in your reports, of course, are the criteria. The criteria against which the subject matter that you're looking at was weighted. Conclusions on the level of assurance that's being provided. Any reservations that the IT audit and assurance professionals might have. Any restrictions on the distribution of the report could also be very important, because audits do get into areas that may be very sensitive and of very confidential information for that organization. So we want to make sure we know, basically that we don't want it out there on WikiLeaks. The date of the report and where it was issued, the name of the issuer of the report, and the auditor and assurance professional's signatures, which of course is the verification that they actually have read the report, at least hopefully they did before they signed it. Now we also had under ITAF the assurance guidelines. This was section 3000. Now actually in this section there are many other subsections that are a part of it, and the IT assurance guidelines are broken down into 4 basic areas, and we're going to look at each 4 of them. Section 3200 was the enterprise topics. Section 3400 is the IT management processes. Section 3600 dealt with the IT audit and assurance processes, and Section 3800 dealt with the IT audit and assurance management. Now, each of these areas are going to focus on the IT issues and processes that a professional should understand and consider during the planning, the scoping, the execution, and reporting of the IT or assurance activities. Now, you notice how that pretty much covered all aspects of this entire audit, right? From planning, scoping, execution, and reporting, right? From start to begin, or even pre-start planning. Now, each of these areas are going to focus on the processes and procedures, the methodologies and approaches that will be considered when you conduct the IT assurance activities. Again, guidelines, trying to help guide you through this process of doing the audit. Now, as we continue to look at the enterprise topics, remember the section is comprised of enterprise-wide issues that can impact the IT audit and assurance professional in the planning and performance of their engagement. That might very well include the upper management and the people that are running that particular organization, as far as, that's a part of this whole enterprise, and some of the things they do or the decisions they make can, of course, impact us. Now, the guideline, and that's what it is, a guideline, how to deal with that, how to steer through those situations, should provide the audit and assurance professional with information such as executive actions, external events, and decisions that might impact the IT department. Again, it's a way of making sure we have the right information as we get into this process of doing the IT audit and assurance. Now, when we look at the enterprise topics, we can actually break it down into even further subcategories. And I'm just going to tell you the subcategories, what they are, so you kind of get an idea of what it's trying to focus on as a guideline. So one of the sections is subsection or subcategory 3210, which is the implication of enterprise-wide policies, practices, and standards on the IT function. 3230 deals with guidelines for the implication of enterprise-wide assurance initiatives on the IT function. Section 3250 would talk about the implication of enterprise-wide assurance initiatives on IT assurance plans and activities. And the last subcategory, 3270, talks about additional enterprise-wide issues and their impact on the IT function. Now, that's all the more in detail. I'm going to get to any of those particular subcategories. But what I hope you're seeing here is that as we're talking about the enterprise, we are really talking about the entire scope of the organization that we're working with. And a lot of this, the enterprise types of topics are dealing with that upper management and how it can affect what we're doing in the audit, how it can affect the plans, how, of course, their influence works with the policies, practices, and standards for how their IT function is currently running. And so, again, guidelines to help get us through this process of being able to successfully do the audit and assurance of the IT organization. Now, as we look at some of the other assurance guidelines, some things to think about under Section 3000 are things like the IT management processes. Now, that section is going to provide guidelines for the IT audit and assurance professional with an understanding of the types of IT management and operations they might find and work with. So, this gets us back to where I said there's no cookie cutter to say that every IT organization is the same, or this is how it should run, right? And I take that template and move it over to a new company and say that's how it should run. That doesn't happen for us. So it's a way of helping us understand the types of management, and again, giving us guidelines for using the information we know about the the organization to perform the planning and taking out the audit and the assurance parts of what we're doing, right, to be able to perform those adequately. Now, these guidelines can aid you in planning and scoping, and that's what I've been trying to convey, is that the more we understand how upper management's working, their policies, their practices, how we understand the organization, all of these guidelines help generally give us a way of figuring out how we want to plan and scope the IT assurance activities that we're going to use. These guidelines can also help us get insight into the practices and procedures of the IT departments. Now, this guideline should focus on planning, organization, and strategizing of the IT department activities. Now, when we talk about the IT management processes, a couple of the other things that we look at is that it's broken down into a lot of different areas. And again, I'm just going to tell you about these different areas that we want to look at the guidelines for the types of management processes. And remember, that's what these are, guidelines for these different processes. And so this kind of gives you information to saying, okay, you know, what is there for me to look at that might detail my particular assignment in this auditing process. We would start off with Section 3410, which would be the IT governance, which of course would be the management of the IT organization. From there, a section, a guideline that talks about the determination of the impact of enterprise initiatives on the IT assurance activities. Another guideline for using the work of other experts in conducting IT assurance activities. And a lot of these should sound very familiar with the CISA guidelines that I was talking about before. Because again, we're looking at third party when we're talking about the use of work of other experts. That's that third party, outside party. Of course, we can look at the guidelines that help us in understanding the approaches to project management, which is Section 3420. 3425 was on the IT information strategy. 3427 was on the IT information management. 3430 deals with guidelines for plans and strategies. 3450 deals with the guidelines for your IT processes. 3470 was on your IT risk management. And 3490 were guidelines that understood the support of regulatory compliance. So I think a lot of those titles of the subsections are pretty intuitive. Project management, information strategy, information management. And so remember that these are guidelines that you can use to help you through the process of your audit and assurance that you're going to be doing on these particular organizations. Now, your IT audit and assurance processes, they're going to focus on the approach to auditing as well as the methodologies and techniques that you're going to use. This section we're going to talk about here is going to provide information on the common practices, issues, concerns, and pitfalls which should be considered during the audit and assurance procedures. Now, your IT audit and assurance processes are again broken down into some smaller sub areas or subcategories, and I'm going to just kind of hit you with them real quick as far as the list and have some discussion about these. The first is Section 3605, which is relying on the work of specialists and others. 3607 was integrating IT audit and assurance work with other audit activities. Oh, now just think about it. Your work in the IT audit might be in maybe a small process of an overall financial audit. And obviously the things that we do with the financials of a company are probably more than likely somehow associated with IT, the communications, the storage of information. And so, we want to look at some of those guidelines about working those together. Using COBIT in the IT assurance process, some guidelines for that, Section 3610. Section 3630, the auditing of IT's general controls. And then we look at the controls and some different aspects of what we do. We also have Section 3650 for the application controls and 3653 for auditing your traditional application controls. So again, guidelines that help you maybe come up with good planning of ways in which you can go about doing the audit of these different types of controls. Some of the other areas that we see in the IT assurance guidelines, again, this is from the ITAF. Remember, it was built, a lot of it on what we've already looked at with ISACA. Section 3655 would be one of those areas, auditing the enterprise resource planning systems, what we talked about before with the ERP. Section 3657 was an area that dealt with auditing alternative software development strategies. Oh, okay, so, again, software development strategies, and we might be looking at the whole software development lifecycle, that SDLC. Auditing specific requirements is Section 3660. Auditing government specified criteria. It gets us back into some of those regulations, expectations. That was Section 3661, and you're probably sitting there saying, do I need to remember these section numbers? No. I'm not. I'm giving them to you so you can look them up more detail as I'm going through these section numbers. But what's important is that you just I want you to make sure you understand what the ITAF is doing with these guidelines, right? They're information we can look at and use in helping us make decisions about how to do some of these different audit programs. So I just talked about the government specified criteria was 3661. Industry specific criteria. And notice you can't get more vague either, right? By the way, that was Section 3662, industry specific criteria. All right, so which industry? Well, you see, that's where we're saying some very vague guidelines at times, because industries have different specifics that they need as far as their criteria. Hospital is different than a chip manufacturing plant, different than somebody building airplanes, right? I mean, they're all different industries. Guidelines for auditing with computer-assisted audit technologies, the CATs, right? The CAATs. Guidelines on IT auditing and regulatory reporting, and guidelines for selecting items that are of assurance interest. Now, your IT audit and assurance management is designed to give guidance to the IT audit and assurance professional with the information that's required to manage an audit. Now, that's a lot of duplicate words, it sounds like, right? Basically, as a auditing team, there is a management portion. And they're going to be the ones that are going to help give us guidance as well, based on all of these guidelines we just saw listed already. And their job is to help in the guidance and the management of, those professionals that are doing the audits and assurance. Now, the guidelines should include topics on the audit and assurance, the planning, the scoping, and putting the information into a detailed audit plan for us, as well as listing the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. Now, your IT audit and assurance management is again broken down into some sub areas. And again, I'm going to go through this list of sub areas with a few interjections in areas that might not sound as clear, but the titles are kind of, I think, straightforward. And again, we're still talking about guidelines, right? In the overall section 3000. And again, we're going to talk about some of the ways in which management has guidelines. The first one is 3810, which is the IT audit or assurance function, guidelines about what it is, what we're creating and working with. And then more specifically in section 3820, the planning and scoping of IT audit and assurance objectives. Section 3830 gives us guidelines for the planning and scoping of the IT audit assurance work. Notice we're breaking down all of these little things, right? Objectives, the work that we're going to do. Next one is the planning and scoping risk assessments. That was section 3835. We have more guidelines, believe it or not, it's a few more. 3840, managing the IT audit and assurance process execution. And the next one is 3850, the integrating of the audit and assurance process together. Again, remember, these are guidelines, and we're looking at them from now the audit and assurance management areas. So these are guidelines for the people that are working or managing this entire process and helping them with a lot of it, right? What are the management really helping us with? A lot of it was on the planning and scoping. And that was, of course, of the assurance objectives, the assurance work, the risk assessments, and the process execution. And that's what is designed, because they are responsible, as I said right a little bit before this, of giving us what those objectives are and assigning people to that, right? That's a part of management. So this helps them in creating that management plan. Some of the other areas that we'll see when it comes to the audit and assurance management areas, as far as our guidelines, falls under the guidelines for gathering evidence. That's section 3860. Now, just one more time, because I know that listening to me drone on about all these different areas, if you think back when I was talking about the guidelines for the ISACA, I pretty much talked about these very guidelines with a little different wording in the titles. So I'm hoping that you remember what it was we were talking about. So I'm kind of showing you the contrasting and comparing, and just again reminding you that that the goal of this domain is to help us in understanding this full life cycle of what we're doing with the auditing. Okay, so gathering evidence is one. Section 3870 is the documenting IT audit and assurance work. The next one, 3875, was documenting and confirming IT audit and assurance findings. And again, these are all important, right? Because we gather evidence to prove our findings. We talked about making sure you get the right evidence, get all the evidence, consider everything, documenting what you've done, document your findings, being able to evaluate your results and develop recommendations, which is the next section, 3830. And what do we do when we get all that done? Well, we got to communicate those recommendations. That's the effective IT audit and assurance reporting, which is covered by section 3890. Then reporting the IT audit and assurance recommendations, 3892. And reporting on IT advisory and consultancy reviews is section 3894. In this lesson, we're going to talk about risk analysis. Now, risk analysis, the goal of it is to determine the risks and vulnerabilities, and then to be able to adequately plan the controls that are going to be needed to lessen or mitigate those risks. Now, the auditing process, we need to understand the relationships between risks and controls, because that's really what the purpose of the controls are, is to somehow reduce the amount of risk that we have to be able to manage or to worry about. That means, as an auditor, we have to know what are the common business risks and the related technology risks as they are related to the audit process. Now, some of the key points that the auditor should have knowledge about are things like the purpose and nature of the business and the environment that it operates in. I think that's key. We need to know what this business does. I mentioned this before, that we might focus on the IT, the IS, but you know what? It's more than information systems. This company does something. As an example, I remember, and I wasn't a part of an audit, but just some other work I did with a chip manufacturing plant. And they build, chips, processors and memory and those sorts of things. And I remember as I was looking at their business and the nature of their business, they instilled into me how their goal and purpose of that business was to make chips. If they didn't make chips, they had nothing to sell. And if they had nothing to sell, they were not in business. And the IT department was nice. It was helpful when they wanted to communicate through email, when they wanted to talk on the phones with voice over IP, when they had their databases and their mainframes. I mean, very nice that we provided, the connectivity and the availability. But they made sure we knew that the purpose of that business was to make chips, to the point that all people, lawyers, vice presidents, IT, IS personnel, programmers, all got into what we called the white bunny suits, the white suits you put on in the clean room, and we learned at least one part of the line, the wet process, dry process, whatever the process was. They made sure we knew how to make chips, because if it got to that point that they needed, to start cutting expenses and to keep the business alive, they knew that they didn't care about their email as much as they cared about making their chips. And that makes sense to me, because without that, they had no money. So what am I getting at? I'm saying the purpose and nature of the business and the environment that it operates in is something you need to have knowledge about. If you don't understand that business and how it works and what their guiding philosophies are and how they operate, then you're not going to have a very successful time even to begin how to plan the audit, let alone understanding what risks that company faces. Now, part of that analysis is to know how much dependence does the business have on technology. Now, that is becoming something that is more and more prevalent in today's world, right? As far as how much technology is involved in all facets of the business. Of course, today we have it from our cell phones, which are, now mini computers, as we're looking at these Droids and iPhones and these netpads. And I mean, it just continues on. And we're seeing that very pervasive in all parts of the technology. It was the mid-90s, I remember, going to a company on the West Coast that did a lot of inventory work. They produced boxes, I'll just say that. And they didn't have any semblance of a network. They were still making orders and keeping track of inventory by pads of paper on a clipboard and trying to go to a manual balance sheet. And this was like 95, 96. And if I look at that company today, and I have, it's a completely different company. Anything that they used to do by paper is now all automated. Everything's 100% automated. And when I think about that short span, I guess, over 10 years, but that's a long time in computer worlds. It just shows me, though, how that dependence is really getting more and more. So, a lot of work here trying to explain why risk analysis is important and why you need to do the research. You need to know how much dependence this business has on the technology and what other risks are associated with IT and any of the related dependencies, and how would that risk impact the goal of the business. Now, the CISA has a risk IT framework that's based on a set of guiding principles and feature business processes and management guidelines to conform to those principles. Now, to get a good understanding of risk, you need to know what risk is. The ISO published a definition of risk as the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset and thereby cause harm to the organization. Now, I'm thinking, okay, that's great. They just told you what risk is, but they threw a bunch of other words in there. Exploits, vulnerabilities. Okay, so let's make sure we got this completely fleshed out, that it makes sense to us. Everything that we see has a vulnerability, and I can't think of any exception. A vulnerability can be a design vulnerability. It can be, if we're going to talk strictly software. We see lots of releases about vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows and patches that we use to fix those vulnerabilities. What does that vulnerability mean? It means that if somebody has the right knowledge and the right access, they could take advantage of that vulnerability and destroy that operating system, or worse than that, take it over. Well, let's take that idea of risk. I want to make it an easy to see picture. If you have a building, a brick and mortar facility that your office is in, I'm betting it's got a vulnerability to fire, right? Probably doesn't do well if it catches on fire. That is a vulnerability. Now, just because it has the vulnerability is not that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to some extent. I don't want to be in that building if it catches fire. But it needs somebody to exploit that vulnerability, right? To set that place on fire purposely or accidentally. And until that exploit occurs, there's the building. It has a vulnerability, but it hasn't been exploited. The risk is, what are the odds that vulnerability will be exploited? Now, it could be an electrical fire, a completely innocent way of starting. It can be from, anything you think of, from arsonists or any number of things that can cause that, lightning strikes, all sorts of things. So what you do is you analyze, what are the risks, what are the buildings like this and those types of crimes or those types of experiences, how likely are they to occur? What can I do to reduce that risk? Like the addition of sprinklers inside the building, water sprinklers right overhead. That's why we put them in there. We're reducing those vulnerabilities. Anyway, so I'm spending a lot of time trying to make sure that you've got a good picture of the definition of risk, using the other words that they threw in there, like the exploits and vulnerabilities. And of course, that brick and mortar building that I talked about, that's the actual asset that we're trying to protect. Now, when you're analyzing IT services, the auditor should specifically be looking at the risks that are associated for the business when using IT services within an enterprise. And that is going to be our focus. What are those risks involving IT? Now, one of the goals of risk analysis is that we're going to, hopefully by doing the analysis, figure out where the vulnerabilities are, to figure out what the potential that those vulnerabilities can be exploited, which is the risk, and then ways that we can mitigate the chances of that happening, at least to a manageable point. If I go back to that idea of the building and putting sprinkler systems in there, knowing that those sprinkler systems can reduce, hopefully at least the damage, but we know that fire could still start, right? In order for the sprinklers to go off, there must be smoke and fire. But it's not going to damage or destroy the entire building. At least we hope not. Maybe one room or one small section. And then we ask the question, is that manageable? Are we willing to live with that level of risk? And that's what we're looking at. And you might say, yeah, one room, that's great. Out of 100,000 square feet, we can live with that risk. We can deal with that. We can move those people to another room that's still functioning until it gets fixed and repaired. So that's kind of the goal. One of the goals anyway of risk analysis is mitigating that risk, lowering the amount of risk to a manageable point. And this can be very crucial to a business, especially one that relies heavily on the support of IT. So, I keep using the building and fire because I think I can paint a better mental picture in describing what what risk analysis is and how it helps us in lowering or mitigating risks. But I want you to take that same mental picture and now think of a database server, right? And how crucial is the data on that database server to your company? Could you live without it? If you lost it and it took you a week to recreate the information in there, could your business still run? If those were all your customers and the only information about those customers and all the orders they've just placed are all stored there, how are you going to recover from that? How crucial is it to you? So you're getting the picture, right? I'm trying to paint a couple of mental pictures so that you really understand the goal of risk analysis. And the reason that's a big deal is that we see the use of risk and the risk analysis in many facets of what we do in the auditing world. All right, so as kind of a review, the risk of an exploit to a vulnerability could negatively impact things like the assets of the organization. And I like this. We're using vague terms. The assets are what's important to you and your company. All right, so I've given you some examples. They can negatively impact processes or objectives of the business. Certainly, they could object, if it was the database of customers, it's going to, impact the ability for me to know what product the customer bought and where to ship it and that sort of stuff. That can damage us financially. It could also lead to us being in violation of regulatory requirements. Some of these could cause operational outages. It was a few years ago in the early part of the 2000s that some operator at an air tower, I think in Mexico, entered a value in that was like 4 characters too long for the field, and it caused a buffer overflow and crashed the air control system, and flights, not only in Mexico but the US, couldn't fly because it was broken. That's an operational outage, and that was one that had a negative impact on the industry. Again, I'm trying to paint pictures for you about these different types of things. All right, so again, they're just examples of how the exploit of a vulnerability can be a negative impact in the corporation. Now, risk assessment can be characterized as a life cycle. The life cycle is we first start by identifying what does this business do? What are the objectives of the business? And then as it regards to information, what are the information assets that are the most important for this business? And that is going to be our primary goal of protecting the most important part of the information. Now, that also means that if, let's say, it was a database of customers, all right, that means that not only do we need to protect where it's stored, and not only is that, the objectives is to work with our customers to sell things to our customers. That's what our business does. So the information asset about our customers is very important to us. That means we need to be looking at risk assessments of the systems that are generating that information and storing that information and manipulating that information. So risk assessment should first focus on the most crucial assets that could do the most damage or be the most costly impact to the organization. So that means that customer database sounds like it's a bigger deal than making sure the intranet bulletin that tells us what's being served at the cafeteria is available for me to see today. Yeah, those are both data, customers cafeteria menu. Obviously, we're going to go after the more important information, the one that we can do with, that we cannot do without, and that's what we should first focus on. Now, part of the risk mitigation, remember mitigation, lowering of the risk, involves identifying controls that can reduce the potential loss. Okay, so that means we need to find some controls, and I've given you some examples. With the building, one of the controls was the sprinkler system, right? That was a way we could lower the risk, and that means I could reduce the potential loss. Likewise, if we're talking about information in a database, one of the controls we could use, I know a lot of you now are thinking security and hacking and all that sort of stuff. How about just another database that's synchronized in a cluster situation where if one goes down, the other one's still available and has all the information? Or maybe not as fancy as that, but a hard drive on a RAID array where we know that if one hard drive fails, the other hard drives will take over until we get a replacement. I mean, there's lots of things, and that's our job, is to figure out ways to lower the risk by identifying controls that can do that for us. Now, often a control should be analyzed through a cost-benefit analysis, meaning what's the cost of that control? I just threw out a couple of examples of another server with another database running on it. That to me sounds expensive. We've got the license of the server, license of the database server running on the server, the cost of the hardware, the cost of the people to put it in, to train them to get it, to maintain it. And then I had another one that was a RAID array. That was just a little rack. Some of them are expensive. That has a lot of hard drives in it. And we can start comparing costs. And we can say, how will this one control minimize the risk? How will this other one minimize the risk? And will either of them minimize the risk to a level that the organization is willing to accept? And so right away, I'm throwing out a bunch of these ideas. And so what we're saying is, we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis. We're going to say, do both controls I just mentioned minimize the risk to an acceptable level? If they do, then maybe we might consider the least expensive of those as a solution. And expense is more than just the cost of hardware, remember. It's all of the costs of the control. That's the training of the people to run it, the knowledge they need, all of that is a part of it. Okay, now, when we say we want to lower that risk, we want to minimize it to something that's acceptable. All right, so what is preferred risk? All right, I mean, we're going to find a method to reduce it, but the thing is, at what level? What rating would we give you as preferred risk? Well, there's some examples. We could say, well, to us, the preferred risk is terminating all of the risk. Now, okay, that's literally impossible, but we can certainly reduce it to a very low number. Minimizing the probability of the risk, or minimizing the impact of the risk, are ways that we can look at reducing the risk. And that's good. Minimizing the probability of the risk, or minimizing the impact. I think my sprinkler system in the building is a better example of minimizing the impact. Now, to minimize the probability of the risk is, if it's about the building and fire, is maybe I would consider furniture that's non-combustible, made out of metal, the uncomfortable stuff. Kind of like this building I went to in Pittsburgh where I was doing some work. It's, I can tell you this, it's the 𝗧𝗿𝗶𝗶𝗀 building, made out of aluminum, everything, including the facilities inside. Not very comfortable, but unique. I'm not thinking that the building itself has big a risk factor to fire, right? Minimize the probability of the risk, and maybe even minimize the impact just by how it was built as compared to my house. But anyway, again, examples I'm trying to paint, the word pictures that help you understand this idea of the risk. So let's kind of recap this whole discussion about risk analysis. We started off by identifying the business objects, and remember, it's kind of a whole life cycle here. Now, in that process of the business objectives, as I said, we wanted to know what keeps this company alive. Why is it here? What's its purpose, its goal? And it's important that we understand, as we always should, that it's up to us to support this business operation. If it doesn't run, it doesn't do what it's supposed to, there is no business. Now, from there, we decided, okay, when it came to information technology, what information assets are supporting the business objectives. I mean, what are the most crucial? What can they not live without and would just take the company completely down if they lost it or there was a loss or an outage? And from that, what we did is we said, okay, we now know what is the first, and by the way, you can very easily have disagreements throughout your entire team that's planning and putting this together. Some might say, well, this database of knowledge is the most important, and others may say, well, you know, if we didn't have this database over here, we could never get this one over here. And I'm speaking, I know, in vague terms, but I'm sure you get the picture of the conversations, which is good. It's a good conversation to have, that you're going through and identifying these assets. Don't get me wrong. Eventually, you'll have a decision maker who will say, all right, this is the most critical. This other one is also very critical, and we'll make them both a part of this process. Nobody said you had to have just one. All we're saying is identifying what those assets are. And if there's more than one, great. That just means you want to do a risk assessment on those assets that you've identified as being crucial. So you perform the risk assessment then. And of course, what's the goal, right? The goal of the risk assessment is to eventually know what we can do to reduce or mitigate that risk. That means we're going to perform a risk mitigation. We're going to be basically mapping risks to the controls that we can use to lower that threat of the risk. And from there, it'll be the next thing we'll do is perform a risk treatment. And at that point, we will then basically implement it. If we've approved it, we'll implement it. And we're going to, at some point, have to periodically redo the evaluation of risk. Because things change. New attacks, new techniques, new weaknesses, new equipment, new programs, I mean, all aspects of technology is constantly on the move. And as we upgrade, update, we're going to want to go through this process again and again and again. So that's why I said it's a risk life cycle. But that's a part of risk analysis. And of course, for the purposes of our audit, this is our way of identifying what we're going to make plans to actually do an audit of, which controls, which, right? So you get the idea that, as why risk analysis is an important part of this process, an ongoing part of this process of the entire audit that we're going to be talking about as we continue to dive in here and talk about all of the different aspects of what it takes to do an audit and assurance analysis. Now let's talk a little bit about internal controls. Now, right off the bat, you could think of internal controls as paper controls. And what I mean by that is they're usually comprised of written policies and procedures and practices. Now, granted that if it is a policy, that does certainly sound like a paper version of a control, whereas procedures and practices may be steps, documentations that outline how you should work with certain controls. So you can make a linkage to an actual physical control, but generally, as we're looking at it here, it is ways in which we should go about doing those particular types of practices or procedures when implementing a specific control. Now, I also realize that when we say control, we're being very vague. And that is purposeful because you're not going to be tested on specific types of controls. In other words, you're not going to be asked to be a firewall specialist or to understand proxy services or to have the fundamental ins and outs of Windows security, those types of things, but rather to have the overall idea of what controls are. And in the term of what we're looking at as far as, as an auditor, and we look at these controls, we have to remember they're designed to provide some reasonable assurance that you're still meeting the business needs, the business objectives, while also trying to achieve the lowest amount of risk that you can, which is the purpose of a lot of these controls. In other words, you should be asking the questions, what should be achieved and what should be avoided when we're looking at how these controls are applied. Now, there are several objectives with internal controls. We could have internal accounting controls that deal with the fiduciary responsibilities of those people involved with any part of that aspect of an organization when it comes to financial matters. We have operational controls, which, as they sound, would maybe be part of the procedures and practices as far as how we should go about working with any particular control that we've installed into our corporation for the purpose of lowering risk. And of course, administrative controls And again, there we get into things like our standard operating procedures, getting into our policies, having documentation about what the goal of the company is going to be, what is expected of the people that are working for them, maybe even disciplinary actions as far as what happens if you go outside or violate any of these controls. But those are the objectives, anyway, of what we're trying to see with internal controls. And certainly we're calling them internal because these are ones developed internally within our organization for the use of the people that are working inside the organization to follow. Now, if we specifically talk about IS controls, we'll look at those objectives. And these types of internal controls should be addressed in a manner that's relevant to and IS-related processes. In other words, these controls were designed as specifically for information services. So we would have controls that we would outline that would talk about safeguarding assets, whether that safeguarding deals with physical security or with encryption standards or communication, remote access. We should have controls that ensure the integrity of the operating systems. There you could maybe even make a case for your antivirus, your spyware, to make sure that an operating system hasn't been corrupted or infected. To ensure the integrity of sensitive and critical applications through the use of controls like authorization, which are, of course, are the permissions that users are allowed to have or different objects can have. Validation is very important when it comes to making sure the information is entered in correctly. That goes kind of hand in hand with accuracy and completeness. And I've certainly been around companies where, as a result of looking at some of their data, I remember one law enforcement agency where the accuracy and completeness was just horrendous when you would start looking it up. In other words, with issues like if you were looking up some name in a arrest database, I would see, like, just for me as an example, and I wasn't in the database, but let me just use my name as an example. I saw times where somebody was listed as Ken Mayer, then Kenneth Mayer, and then the middle initial, and they were all listed as separate people because at whatever time that that transaction occurred, some form of that name was, slightly longer or shorter, middle initial, no middle initial, and all listed as separate entities, and that certainly wasn't right. We need to look at controls for reliability and accuracy as well of the information that we're working with, or of whatever if it's not just information, reliability could be for the performance of network traffic, being able to flow smoothly across the network. Accuracy as well kind of goes back into making sure the information that we see is appropriate. It could be accuracy in firewall policies. There's a lot of different things that we see with these control objectives, and again, by just that kind of quick variety I gave you, you can see why it's purposely vague as far as trying to tell you what the goal of these controls are. Now, controls can be categorized into a series of classifications. They're often considered some controls as preventive, some as detective, and some as corrective. Okay, so preventive controls. Now, think about this. Controls are more than just devices that I put out onto the network or software that's running. I could make a case that a preventive control for my IS department is having the magnetic key lock that keeps people from getting into the server room without having a proper type of identification and access card to get in. It's preventing them from getting in and maybe stealing or destroying equipment. Detective controls. I could make the same argument if I just want to stick on that physical security type of control for IS. Could be the closed circuit TVs to be able to watch and see what people are doing, or to record their entrance and exit out of the particular server rooms. It could be a detective control as far as the operating system, as I mentioned with antivirus software. Corrective, of course, would be controls that were designed to repair some of the issues that we've seen that go on. And all of these, again, are ways to classify what or categorize, I should say, what a control was designed to do. So as we look at some of the control objectives, some of the other objectives might be things like the proper identification and authentication of users. Well, that gets us into that authorization, authentication, sometimes what we call the AAA. The other A being accountability. Efficiency and effectiveness of operations is another objective of a control. Another one is to make sure that there's compliance with user requirements, to organizational policies and procedures. Now, it's an important aspect, right? Because when we create policies and procedures, we tell the users what we expect of them, what's acceptable, and we have to have ways to make sure that they're in compliance with that. The construction of a business continuity plan is certainly a good control, one that we'll take a look at in other sections. The business continuity plan, though, is a way of maintaining that high availability should any type of outage or interruption come in. It could even get to the point where we talk about the disaster recovery plan, whether it's a disaster because of nature types of incidents, earthquakes, tornadoes, that type of thing, a disaster from actual malicious attacks. It could be a disaster from a gross error of a user, maybe wiping out a whole database. Lots of things that we have to have recovery plans for us, another type of control. And of course, with things like business continuity, disaster recovery, more than likely that's for something very specific that has occurred to cause a big outage, and we need to have another control like an incident response plan that says, okay, when these types of things happen, we have to have a team, a list of people who are ready to go out and take up certain responsibilities in a pre-planned or pre-orchestrated manner to try to recover from these incidences. So again, all of these are types of controls which I try to use examples that were not just firewall and VPN concentrator and some of those typical security devices that a lot of us kind of focus on sometimes whenever we talk about information systems. Now, CISA provides a framework to support the governance and management of IT. Now, it's a framework with 34 IT processes that are pretty much grouped into one of these 4 domains, whether it's planning and organizing, acquiring and implementing. You could think of hardware and new routers, new servers, those types of things. Deliver and support of those objects that we've acquired, and of course monitoring and evaluation, which is an ongoing part of the process for most aspects of information services. One of the goals for CISA is to link the business goals to the IT goals and to be able to have metrics, a way of measuring the achievement of that linkage. Remember again that even though IT can be thought of as being very crucial to almost all enterprises, it is still important to remember that we're supporting the enterprise in whatever it is that keeps that company going. I keep using the term, if the company makes widgets, the goal of IT is to help that company be more successful and efficient at being able to make those widgets. All right, so and again, that's where CISA comes in trying to align those IT goals with the business goals, and to be able to have a series of best practices that you can use as a framework to be able to meet that goal. As we take a look at controls, we'll start off just by talking about general controls. Now, these could include policies, procedures, and practices that are established by management. And again, it sounds like these paper types of controls. Now, we can have these types of policies, practices, procedures that describe working with internal accounting controls. It could be on operational controls or administrative controls. And again, if you think about this and how vague they all sound, and I feel like I need to apologize for that, but the goal is simply to say that as an auditor, or as a process of trying to talk about auditing, it's hard to be able to take any one company and say that's the perfect company to use as our example, because every company is different in how they put things together. So these are ways in which we can convey what you should be looking at. An internal accounting control it can be a number of things. It can be based on a program. It can be based on having some sort of segregation of duties where it takes several people to verify the financial records that are being used. Operational controls could certainly be ways of just talking about acceptable use, what you can or can't do with email or with your access to the internet. Administrative controls would govern potentially things like hiring practices and human resource issues. You also have your security policies and procedures, and I do promise you that you're going to see more about these in another section as we get into other domains. But again, the policies and procedures are controls that we put out that say, policy, the framework, the blueprint of what we're trying to accomplish, and the procedures being a series of steps, the ways in which you might work with certain controls. We should have policies for the documentation. Documentation if we notice something unusual going on. Documentation if we went outside of a guideline or a procedure and why we did that. if an error or an outage occurred, you know, all of these things, we should have policies and reasons for when that documentation should be created. Some of the other general controls might be procedures and practices on what's called acceptable access to the use of assets and facilities. I remember back in the old days, you know, this is before you had cellular phones, before you had voice over IP at everybody's house. We used to pay, and I know that sounds crazy for some of you a bit younger, we used to pay for long distance. And so my parents worked at a company that allowed us to go in on a Sunday afternoon and utilize their phone system to make long distance calls to talk to family. So that way they were paying for it and we didn't have to pay for it. That was an acceptable access to the use of assets and facilities. That meant that I couldn't go in Saturday, I couldn't go in Monday during the daytime, but they put in times where we were allowed to be able to basically utilize these assets and facilities in a way that was an acceptable practice. And of course, physical and logical security policies as well. Remember, physical security would certainly be things like guards, gates, and cameras, and logical security could be the way in which the network is segmented and control of access through maybe routing or through firewall technologies. All of these ideas of types of security policies. Now, a well-designed information system should have controls for all of its sensitive or critical functions. Now, the IS control procedures would include things like strategy and direction. Again, remember, trying to keep in line with the business goals. Of the organization's management, very important, especially in a reporting chain, to know, you know, basically who to go to if there's any escalation. There should be controls over access to IT resources, such as your data and different programs. Controls for the system development methodologies. Now, that's right. We are talking about the potential of having to insert new technologies or to make upgrades, so there should be controls about that kind of go hand in hand with the idea of change control. Change control, by its name, has that word control in there. Very important aspect as far as how we respond to trouble tickets. In other words, if some trouble ticket comes my way, I'm just not going to start to change policy somewhere on a firewall to fix the issues. We have to go through a little bit more planning, because any one little change I make, whether I think it's right or not, could have a negative ripple effect against other portions of my network. So we want to make sure we're looking at all aspects of our systems before we make changes. That also goes hand in hand with a quality assurance. The controls for quality assurance is basically my way of making sure that we are staying in compliance. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these. Physical access, of course. I've talked about key cards to get into a network. In fact, I remember a time I was in the middle part of the country, down in some of the southern states, and I was at this large headquarters for a nationwide company, actually worldwide company, and I had a card that, you know, visitor access, physical access to certain rooms, but there was this one room I couldn't get into. In fact, it was kind of funny, because as I was walking down the hallways, all the doors were labeled except for one. And I thought to myself, that's the important room, because it didn't have a label. Some of those things we address, you know, when we talk about physical security. Anyway, so I'm looking through this little pane of glass, and I can see in there that it's kind of a man trap. There's another door, and that other door looks like it has a key code combination. The one I was facing had a key card access, and my card didn't work on it, because I did try. And it looked like there was another little podium for either a handprint or a thumb. And I thought, wow, this really is an important room. And while I'm peering through the window, somebody walks up behind me and scares me and says, "Hey, can I help you?" And at that point I said, "Yeah, I just wanted to see inside the Network Operations Center." I was guessing what it was. And told them that, you know, I was there to do this other project. And the guy said, "Sure, come on in, follow me." All right, so controls for physical access. I'm thinking maybe, just maybe, I shouldn't have been allowed in, but again, that's about controls. Are those controls in place? Are people following them? I know, long story, but I'm trying to make sure that we understand some of the goals of what these controls are designed to do. Operations procedures, again, following procedures. Procedures are step-by-step processes that we can use. Could be, operations for adding a new user account, or operations for doing a database backup, those types of things. Business continuity, disaster recovery plans certainly are part of controls. Network security, database administration, having controls in there for the protection and detection against internal or even external threats. You can think again of hackers or an external threat, by the way. It doesn't have to be a person. It can be an act of nature, earthquakes and floods and those types of things as well. This lesson is going to be about performing an IS audit. Now, auditing is a systematic approach or process that we use to objectively obtain and evaluate evidence regarding the assertions we make about a process or that were made to us about a process. Now, the goal is to form an opinion and report on how well the assertions made to us have been implemented. All right, so what does it mean, an assertion? You know, if I'm getting ready to audit and they say we have, this centralized antivirus software that's monitored by a central location and it does all these things, that's an assertion you're making to me. And I'm saying, okay, that's great. So my goal is to form an opinion and report about how well what you told me it's supposed to do, how it's doing it, and how well it's implemented, those types of things. So there are several steps, though, required for me to be successful in doing an audit. Number one, of course, adequate planning. I don't want to just walk in and say, okay, I'm here to audit your network. I think I'll start here. There has to be some sort of plan in place that I'm going to follow, a plan that's got the objectives and the scope of what I'm supposed to be doing. Part of that is I also need to be assessing risks while I'm going through this process. Now, assessing risks is knowing that everything does have a risk. And your goal is to assess to what level that risk is occurring. Now, from that information, as we're taking the plans and we know what the risks are, and if you think about it, by my looking at and assessing the risks involved in all of these processes, again, depending on the scope of what I'm supposed to be testing, I can make plans to make the audits based on the risks that you've determined are an issue that you need to look at. All right, from there I'm going to create an audit program, and that should have the objectives and procedures. What is the goal of this audit program? What am I going to do? What steps, again, procedures or steps, am I going to follow to meet the objectives I've stated in this audit program? During the process of the audit, you are going to be gathering evidence. Now remember, your goal is not to make somebody fail, right? In fact, this is not a pass-fail situation at all. We should be gathering evidence that both support the assertions or perhaps contradict the assertions made to us, but our goal is to be objective, to gather information so we can make it a better system all around. That means we evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses based on the testing. And from that, of course, we take the results, create reports that include our recommendations. Now, when we talk about performing the IS audit, there should probably be a project manager or project management for the audit. And it's up to the people in the project management to develop the detailed audit plan, to report the project activity that we've taken against the plan, in other words, to be able to keep up to date. So if I have a plan, I might, as a manager, say, where are you in this plan? What have you done? And give me the results, and so I'm plotting it out, making sure you're staying on plan and that you didn't deviate somewhere because you got bored or something like that. We also want to make sure that as we're doing the audit, if we realize that some aspects of the plan might need to change, and that will happen, right? It'd be great if I came up with the perfect plan and never had to deviate from it, but sometimes, of course, we're going to have to deviate. We might not have understood a business process or objective as well as we'd like to. Maybe we didn't understand the assertions or weren't communicated to us as well as we'd like to. And so we say, oh, okay, all right, I got that clarification. Here are some adjustments we're going to take or some corrective actions that we need to take with the plan that we've set out. When we talk about the classifications of audits, there are different types of audits that could be performed, and so we kind of generally categorize them. Of course, a financial audit would be just as it sounds. We're working with money. It could be issues of payables, of customer accounts, depending on the type of business. The operational audits would be the day-to-day work that we see in information services, the types of controls that we have that are trying to protect our assets. And an integrated audit would be trying to see how those operational audits are helping us on the financial audit front in making those types of protections and controls of both the operation as opposed to the financial parts of this. Even as I'm speaking to you, a huge news story over the weekend has come out about all of these customer accounts being stolen from a variety of different shopping outlets, mostly I think online. And that to me seems like there could be some financial issues in there, as well as operational issues, and how those two are integrated together to figure out, where the failures occurred, as far as trying to come up with a better way of making those safer through the purpose of our auditing. We can have administrative audits, which is looking at the management and how we're seeing those different types of policies and procedures being implemented. Administrative audits, we're not talking necessarily technology. It could be human resource issues, hiring issues, firing issues, all of those things. Of course, IS audits is a part of that. We might have some specialized audits. Specialized audits could be auditing a third-party contractor that is, perhaps you've outsourced some of the IS processes to. It could be very highly specialized controls or processes that maybe we need to bring other types of auditors that are experts in that field to be able to perform those functions for us. We could also be performing a forensic audit, which generally is looking for irregularities or signs of criminal activity as it concerns our actual organization. And so these are some of the types of audits, remember, the classifications of some of the audits that we're doing. During your audit of an organization, you may be doing 2, 3, or all of these types of audits, depending again on the scope of what you were hired to do. Now, the overall audit program should be based on the scope and objectives of the assignment at hand. And it's very important that we have that outlined in our program, because again, the scope and objectives is another part of that, keeping out of trouble. If during the process of my doing an audit, I might learn of potentially a new objective. Maybe I've discovered some service, some hardware device, something that I think might be contributing to what is inside my scope and objectives, but it's not clearly outlined. That might be where we go and look to see if we can change the scope and objectives in the auditing plan. But I'm not going to freelance and go out there and test something just because I saw it. That would be going outside the objectives and could incur some criminal or even civil liability for it. So again, the scope and objectives, they are dependent on the type of audit that's being performed, and they're designed to let me know as the auditor what I'm supposed to be focusing on so I don't deviate outside and again potentially cause other issues down the road. Now, your general audit procedures, right? Steps, things that we should do. Number one, of course, is gathering information of the audit area. We need to know what it is that we're going to be looking at. I don't want to suddenly discover that there's an email server out here on the network. It's one of these things that if I go back to the original plan, I need to know how that organization functions. I need to know what is there so that we can adequately create this plan. So I need to have information, the documentation of the audit area. From there, we should look at any risk assessment or perform a risk assessment. Now, risk assessments, and we see this in more detail in a different domain, is basically trying to figure out what are the vulnerabilities of the assets we're looking at, and what are the threats of and chances that those vulnerabilities can be exploited. And that's what we're looking at as risk assessment, because it's that risk assessment that can help us with understanding what types of safeguards and controls we want to use. So we want to gather that information, know the area, look at the risks, and then create an audit plan and a schedule of when that's going to occur. Now, we should, as best as we can, have a detailed audit planning steps. Again, I don't want to just walk in and say, well, I'll start over here. I want to see a plan, because every process may have some subordinate processes it depends on. And so when I'm starting, I don't maybe want to look at a subordinate process first, but maybe look at it in a organized method, saying, okay, I'm going to look at this process. Maybe I'm auditing the security of your database storage. And I realize that, I'm going to look at the database. But as a part of that, I may also be interested in remote access capabilities from the network, and that's fine. But I want to have some steps, some plans that says where I should start, what I should be looking for, and move from there. You should include a preliminary view of the audit area, which I think goes hand in hand with the original prior to creating the plan, which is gathering information about the audit area. You should verify the way in which you're going to evaluate controls. Now, that's important, right? Because we want to know that we have the right types of tests that we're going to be using. When you are doing the testing, you're going to be looking at compliance and substantive testing, and we'll talk about each of those here in a bit. And of course, from the end of that, we're going to gather the information, gather the evidence we have, and that's going to be a part of our reporting and follow-up that we use in the general audit. Now, again, reporting is going to be just that, the results of our findings. We're going to have recommendations, and the follow-up, if it's a part of our charter, can be to go back in and see how well the recommendations are being implemented. Now, as part of the procedures for testing and evaluating IS controls, you might consider that they're the use of audit software. Now, this is especially important because in some instances there could be an overwhelming amount of data that we humanly couldn't go through an audit in any short amount of time. So we might have some audit software that's helping us in that process. You know, I think of historically when this huge company of Enron was going under quite a bit of scrutiny for a lot of accounting irregularities. I was told that the amount of information that they had to audit, and this was many years ago, but was in the many terabytes of data. I don't know how many people it would take, you know, for us to be able to adequately go through terabytes of information manually. And so I'm going to imagine that there was some sort of auditing software used to help make that task easier. Flow charting techniques is another part of the procedures that we go through. Use of audit logs or reports. You know, that would be your your syslog services. Your audit logs, you know, if you're looking at physical security, it could be things like who came in, who's left, you know, who came to work, who didn't come to work, you know, those types of things. I mean, I'm kind of all over the place because, again, we're being very general about the type of auditing. We want to review the documentation presented to us, documentation about a control, about a process, about their own procedures and policies. We need to ask questions. We need to ask questions about the people that are involved with the processes that we're auditing. A lot of times we're going to be asking questions to see if the steps that they go through match the procedures that their company has put forth, making sure that they're in compliance, making observations about how people do their jobs. And all right, I got to tell you, people get nervous around auditors because, you know, when you're watching them, they're going to probably, that's the time that they're going to follow the procedures exactly, hoping that they've memorized those procedures rather than any little shortcuts they've taken. And I realize that kind of makes auditing different, you know, difficult, I should say, to do because we might not getting a true glimpse into how things are happening. But again, that's where we can ask questions, make observations, and our goal is not to vilify anybody. It's to just basically see what we're there for, an audit, to find out if they're in compliance, if you know, if there's things we can do for improvements. You should also include walkthroughs. I mean, you should see the areas that you're auditing. The walkthrough could be logical in your scanning through the setup of a database server, you know, or you know, through encryption technologies, or it could be a walk through the entire department that you're auditing. But you should be familiar with the area. And again, we've said that several times in many different ways. That is, that you should have a good knowledge of what it is that you're going to be auditing. Now, the methodology you use for auditing should first be approved by management, and it's going to contain the set of documented procedures that are designed to achieve the audit objectives. Now, this should have a statement of scope, objectives, and audit programs. Now, why should we talk about management when later on I told you you need to be independent? Okay, we're still talking about independence. But, you know, the idea is that your audit methodology, and let's just look at it from this standpoint. There are some, and I'm going to put some things together. You know, I talked about that there are some automated software programs you might use for auditing. Some of those, and let me just use one example of a free program that you can go and download and look at and verify what I'm saying. It's called 𝗪𝗧𝗔, and it's a vulnerability scanner. And you know, that's great because it can go through and do that automation, maybe look at a server to see if it's been patched, if it's got any, you know, known issues of vulnerabilities. But what they tell you in the use of something like 𝗪𝗧𝗪 is that some of the plugins, some of the things that the tests that they do could cause a server to crash. Now, if you do this type of an audit methodology this type of a step during a high point of production, you take a server down. now we've caused the damage that we're trying to prevent against operations. And so, I think it's something management needs to approve, that they know what the risks are. And we haven't even talked about audit risk, really, but there is a risk to our doing an audit. One of them could be what I've just described. So it's important that management approves the methodology and the procedures that we're going to go through to get to those objectives, because they may have input in saying, yeah, that is important to do, but the timing now might be a part of that detailed procedure of when should we do certain types of audits. Now, the phases of the audit methodology. We start off with, of course, the audit subject and the objectives and scope of what it is that we're auditing. Again, objective is, what's the goal? What are we trying to test for? And the scope is, in many ways, giving us the permission to look at the audit subject. Meaning that if we want to look at something else and it's outside of our scope, we don't have the rights. We don't have those permissions to do that. We want to keep within scope, know the objectives. We should have some pre-audit planning. And again, that's important because the planning portion could be when the audit's going to be, what resources we're going to use to perform that audit. All of these things that go together in helping make sure that we're ready to properly do this audit, which then takes us through the audit procedures and the steps that we would use for data gathering. We should have procedures on the different types of tests we're going to use to evaluate that object or that subject. When we're done, we should be able to take and gather that information, that evidence, and to be able to include it into the reporting and our communication back to those who've chartered us to do these audits. And of course, we're going to gather that information and use it for the preparation of the report that we turn in as that final product. In fact, you got to remember that that report is really what you're getting paid for, is that final work being done. Inherently, you may find irregularities or even outright signs of criminal actions or fraud. And it's important that management has established, implemented, and that they maintain controls to try to deter or detect these signs of frauds. And it's part of our goal is that while we're doing these audits, we have to be mindful that we might find those types of signs. I mean, it's sad if we do find it, on many fronts, but it's a part of our job. So what happens? Well, you have internal controls. Internal controls can fail. They could be improperly configured. That means the exploits could be because of a bad design. There might be a weakness in the control. It could be a hacker that's taken over. And we need to look at those signs. As an example, if maybe your internal control is a firewall, and during my audit I find an unusual rule setting that's allowing some sort of odd access from the outside. And I might think to myself, why is that there? Or maybe somebody changed, or maybe right before the audit they changed the policies, and now I want to go back and hope that you have some sort of management system that has the old policies. So I can wonder, because it makes me curious. I'm here today to do an audit, and this policy set is new. It's not the one that was there yesterday when you heard I was coming in for an audit. It makes me think, why? Why did that change? It very well could have been a part of a scheduled maintenance window, a plan change. That's great. But that's where you're looking and saying to yourself, asking these questions, about any signs of tampering or evidence that something is irregular, or maybe, like I said, an instance of fraud. All right, so kind of went all over the place with that, but I think you got the picture, right? Is maybe they were trying to hide, a little back door that had been put in there for the purpose of an employee coming in later from the outside and doing something they shouldn't. Now, many regulations will place responsibilities on management and the auditors to disclose any signs of fraud, whether it's material or not. In other words, let's say I'm working for a securities industry. If I see anything that sounds or looks like there's the potential for fraud, I have regulatory laws and requirements that say that I must make certain reports. It may be that I'm required and bound to not only tell management, but to report any of these irregularities to the SEC. You need to know what are the responsibilities, especially for you as an auditor, on the disclosure of fraud and to whom it has to be made. Whether it's material or not. In other words, the indication that it's there, potentially there, even if it was just completely not fraudulent, it was just, something unusual, at that point, you're detecting it. You're not suddenly the new investigator that's going to go in and look at it in more detail. That might be very well outside the scope of what you're trying to audit. So it's just important you understand what are those responsibilities. They should be in your charter. They should be something you know very well as you're going through the process of doing the audit. Now, auditors should be on their toes, looking for possibilities that there are opportunities for fraud. Remember that internal controls don't eliminate fraud. In fact, I remember talking with the company, not on an audit matter, but on a security matter, talking about multi-factor authentication, which multi-factor simply meant that instead of just username and password, they were wondering if they should have some sort of biometrics, or if they should be using some sort of RSA token, those types of things. And it was important for me to make sure that they understood that what they were looking at really wasn't going to secure them anymore, other than maybe keeping potential hackers or outsiders from entering the network, because an employee who authenticates perfectly well with username and password in their key cards or their smart cards or their fingerprint could still perpetuate crimes against your network. Just hopefully you'd be able to figure out who they are because they had to log in. So they don't eliminate fraud. There is no perfect security. I wish there was, and that I wish I was the one that developed it so it could be very rich. So just remember, their controls are there, but they don't eliminate fraud, and controls can be exploited. They can certainly be overridden. Overridden by somebody internally turning a control off or changing it, overridden with a buffer overflow attack. There's lots of ways in which a control can be exploited. Now, if, again, an indication of fraud has been detected, you need to communicate the need for a more thorough investigation, not by yourself necessarily, but to the appropriate authorities, whether that's management, as I said, or other regulatory entities. Again, auditors should be knowledgeable in the potential legal requirements concerning the limitation of fraud detection and how to report such occurrences. And one more time, I'll say that if you detect signs of fraud, you suddenly don't become that police officer who's now going to investigate that fraud to the fullest extent. That is probably more than outside the scope of what you were hired to do. But your job is to get it reported so people can do that kind of investigation. Now, risk-based auditing are audits that are becoming more and more popular. And this approach assesses the risk and assists the auditor in deciding to perform either compliance testing or substantive testing. Now, the risk-based audit can help the auditor basically determine the nature and extent of testing. Now, I realize that we haven't really gotten into a full-blown discussion on what risk assessment is. And so you're going to have to kind of keep this in the back of your head that a risk basically is the threat that something will exploit a vulnerability in a control. Now, all that means, and again, you have to remember, don't think just hackers, even though we're kind of focusing on information technology. A fire to the building can certainly be a risk. It certainly is a threat, to the vulnerability. That is that your servers and routers and switches are probably not fireproof. So that's a vulnerability, isn't it? Anyway, risk-based audit is designed to help you understand the nature and extent of what it is that you want to test. Within the risk-based auditing, there is inherent risk, control risk, or detection risk. None of those by themselves need to be a major concern because we're not relying just on risk, but we should also look at the internal and operational controls as well as have knowledge of the company's operations. In other words, because there's no such thing as perfect security, as I've already said, there's always going to be risk. There's going to be risks of the controls we choose to use, risks that are just inherent in the nature of what we do. And it's our acknowledgement that they exist and what type of internal and operational controls are we using to reduce and minimize that risk. Now, that type of assessment can help you later on when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis of what controls are being used to help mitigate these known risks. Now, your business risks should include the probable effects of uncertainty. Uncertainty could be issues financially, You never know when there's going to be another stock market crash, right? Those types of things. Regulatory laws changing, they do change. Very hard for me to know what the future entails. Operational changes may occur. It could be also risks from a specific technology that you may be introducing into the network. All of these, like I said, have some uncertainties. And you need to include the probable effects of some of these uncertain events. Now, uncertain doesn't mean unpredictable. It just means that these events could occur, but you're not certain if they would occur, when they would occur. But it's important to at least say if they occurred. Here are some things that we have found. With risk-based auditing, you have what we call the risk model assessment. Now, the risk model assessment could be something as simple as creating weights for the types of risks that you've identified. And when I say the types of weights, and again, I know we haven't gotten into full risk assessment, risk analysis. But there are a couple of ways in which you can do some methodologies for this risk analysis. And it might just be simply saying, look, what are the odds that you think that these risks could occur? And putting some weight, some prioritization. Or risk assessment can be a scheme where the risks have a much more elaborate weight-based rating depending on the significance of the risk as well as the importance of the asset being protected. So what we're doing is through all of these, either one of these, is really trying to look at the importance of the asset and the high likelihood of the risk being able to cause a problem. And that kind of puts a focus for us on what's most important that we should be looking at and going on from there. Well, now let's take a look at audit risk and materiality. And what that means is that there is risk that the information that you create in the course of your audit might contain material errors that go undetected during the audit, meaning that there's a risk that your audit missed something. And so it's important that we understand that. Now, when we talk about some of these risks, there are things like inherent risk. That means, a risk that an error exists that can be material or significant if combined with other errors during the course of the audit. Now, that's an important aspect, right? We all know that we can and will make mistakes, and we can miss things. And you might say, well, okay, I missed it. It's just this minor little detail. But, when you pile them all up, right, that could be something rather significant. There's a control risk, a risk that a material error may exist and may not be prevented or detected in a timely manner by the internal control system. A detection risk, saying that the auditor maybe used bad test procedures in trying to determine the problems. And all of that could create what we call the overall audit risk, which is a combination of all of these categories used in the audit to assess each of these specific controls. Now, an audit risk should describe the level of risk that an auditor is prepared to accept during the audit engagement. In other words, we're telling you, plan on making mistakes, plan on missing things. Now, you can set a target level of risk and then adjust the amount of detailed work that you're going to use in your plan to help minimize that risk. Now, the term material, as we talk about the material information, that refers to an error that should be considered significant to any party concerned with the audit, and materiality is a matter of professional judgment that should include a consideration of the effect of the organization that's being audited. So as you're looking at the course of the audit risk and materiality, we understand that we can we can say, all right, there is inherent risk that we could miss something. I can suggest a lot more work, maybe a lot more time, maybe it's a cost issue, to try to minimize that risk. But we realize that if we miss something, that it can be material. It could be significant to whoever it is that has hired us for the audit, and to what depth that material risk can be is what we call the materiality, and that's up to a lot of professional judgments of one person saying, oh, it's not that bad, another just saying, yeah, it's absolutely horrible. So again, it's just something that we have to look at and plan for in the conducting of our audits. Now, auditors should have a good understanding of the audit risks when they plan their audits, because again, that's where we can go in and say, you know, I realize that there are some issues that could be material to the audit, and so we may change the plans and make them more detailed. Now, it is certainly possible that an audit sample, you know, if you have a bulk amount of information, you might take a sample and be doing what we call the process called sampling, and that is potentially you're going to miss things, that you're not going to detect every potential error in that sample population. Now, the alternative is to look at all potential records, but you know, again, it may not be humanly possible to review that kind of information in a timely manner, and depending on how much information, even within your lifetime. And so we know sampling is something we normally do. Now, to try to alleviate that, make sure that you're using good statistical sampling, have a strong quality control process so that you can try to reduce the amount of audit risk. Now, the materiality of the audit risk can come, as we said, from not detecting a minor error. But again, one minor error by itself might not be enough to really cause a problem. But if we have many of those, they can cascade into a larger problem. Materiality should be considered in terms of the total potential impact to an organization that can be realized through these series of minor errors. Now, one of the things we need to do is assess security risks and actually talk about the treatment of those risks. As an auditor, we need to be familiar with how the organization that we're going to audit has approached their idea of risk assessment and treatment. In other words, what are they willing to accept? How do they want to deal with risk? Now, risk assessment should be able to identify, quantify, and prioritize risks against the criteria that were set forth in the risk acceptance policy. Now, the criteria, the design of it, is to have priorities for managing security risks, for implementing controls to be able to reduce or mitigate those risks. The process of risk assessment is designed as a systematic approach of risk analysis and comparing the estimated risks against those criteria, right, those priorities, to determine the significance of that risk. And it should be performed, the risk assessment should be performed whenever there are changes in the environment. Changes in the environment can simply be through the process of adding new equipment. You might have a change of security requirements. It might be because of new technologies or new programs, or just the fact that we see new types of attacks on the horizon. And of course on the risk situation. And the idea is of course risk assessment should be done before we even begin the audit, part of the planning process. But we know that we should constantly be doing risk assessments whenever we see these types of changes in the environment. The concept of treating risk is the decision we make on basically what criteria do we use to determine whether or not we're going to live with a certain amount of risk. Now, the options we have, of course, a lot of the ones that I've been talking about or alluding to, is the reduction of risk through the use of appropriate controls. But then again, we have to make sure that, when we do the cost benefit analysis of those controls, the amount that we're reducing the risk might not even pay for the control that we've put in. Now, again, if it's just on a pure price point, that might be an issue. Then again, we might have to put the control in anyway because of regulatory requirements. Don't you like the way I can talk into circles about this, as far as what you have to look at? I'm just trying to give you lots of options and things to think about as you talk about risk treatment. Anyway, so that might be one treatment, is to reduce risk. The other is to accept risk. Now, as long as the acceptance of the risk meets the levels and the criteria that matches the organization's policy, then that works out well. You could also avoid risks by stopping the actions that can cause risks to occur. That means if you don't want outside hackers breaking into your network through your web server, you could just remove your web presence. But then if you're an e-commerce company, that wouldn't make sense to do. But that's the example. You can also transfer the risk, and we can transfer it to insurance companies, that if we do have a material damage, that they would compensate us for that loss. We could transfer it to our suppliers. Again, so if the material that comes in, doesn't work very well, or it breaks, it's within contractual time periods to be replaced, that's up to the suppliers to do. Those are just some options that we have to look at as far as what the organization wants to do for the treatment of risk. Now, if the goal is through the use of controls to try to reduce risk, then we need to make sure that we get the ones that will do the reduction that we want to an acceptable level. That means you need to look at, number one, the requirements and constraints of the cost benefits and of the appropriate regulations. You need to know what the organization's objectives are. You should look at the operational requirements and constraints. Oh, that's another big thing. You might buy this really unique vendor's control solution that's, say, firewall. I like to use that because it's an easy example. But I might have people who've never heard of that company, have no idea how to implement it. So I might have constraints as far as the resources to even be able to work with that. And of course, it comes down to cost effectiveness. Do I want to spend, $1 million to reduce my risk 100,000? Right? And again, I'm just throwing out numbers. But you understand the idea is that, reduction worth the cost of the control? Now, remember that some controls might not apply to every information system environment for all organizations. So just because you audited company A and you found a solution that used a certain control and you see company B seems to have some similarities, there's no way that you can assume that that control for company A would be the perfect solution to company B. In fact, you'd almost be kind of guilty of doing a cookie cutter solution. Remember that not all controls apply to all companies, and so that's a process we go through to look at the cost benefit analysis to make sure that it meets regulatory requirements, business requirements, organizational objectives, and it does the reduction that you're looking for. Finally, it's important to remember that no set of controls will ever give you complete security. There's no such thing as 100% security. That means management should implement some ongoing features like ongoing monitoring and evaluation, and realize that they are things they could do to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of security controls. And again, that's the ongoing monitoring and evaluation. If through monitoring and evaluation, you see that you could make some changes, let's say, I'm going to use a firewall example again, with some of the actual security policies, well, that might make it more efficient and more effective. It's just a matter of having these systems in place to be able to constantly improve the controls we have. Now, when it comes to the risk assessment techniques, you have to remember that there's a large variety of audit subjects that you have to look at. I mean, potentially, right? If we're talking about information systems, you have everything under that's there, the operating systems, the users, the database, the data that's being stored, how the information is transported, how it's stored. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and I'm just scratching the surface. And it all depends, of course, on the organizations that you're auditing. Now, each of these different areas that we're talking about will have different types of risk, different types of audit risk as well. There are many computerized and non-computerized methods that we can go about using to perform risk assessment. And the methods that we use can range from a simple classification of high, medium, and low for the priority of the asset that we're looking for, or the priority of the risk that could occur. You may also find more complex scientific equations that might provide numeric risk ratings as well. They certainly are out there and they exist, but again, the vagueness I realize in communicating these to you is because there's no one size fits all when it comes to these classifications for these objectives that we're talking about. And it's important that you understand the concepts. So again, if you think about it as far as the classification systems, high, medium, and low are ambiguous, and you might have other types of classifications that basically convey the same type of rating scale. And yes, depending on what objects we are or subjects we are auditing, there may be complex equations that help give good numeric risk ratings that are either available by the vendor, available through the sciences of computer information, many different places. So it's just important that you understand that our goal is to understand the methods of performing risk assessment and what some of the outcomes we're expecting from that risk assessment. Now, as an example of a risk assessment approach, you might use a scoring system to be able to prioritize audits based on risk factors. Some of the variables you might consider, well, what's one of the risk factors? How technically complex is the subject that we're auditing? Because, it might be outside my skill set, and we may have to bring other people in, third parties that could bring in and introduce new risk. We also want to look at the level of control procedures that are in place and the potential loss. What is the actual real loss or financial loss to the organization with that subject that we're trying to audit, that we're looking at to evaluate the risks that could be facing that particular subject, or what we'll later on call an asset that we're trying to protect. Another form of risk assessment is basically judgmental. That means decisions can be made based on your business knowledge, management directives, historical information, or even on business goals. The auditor should consider the level of complexity and detail that is appropriate for the audit as well. Now, risk assessment can be used to determine the areas to be audited, and we again can base that on a lot of information, like number one, do we have limited audit resources? If we do, then certainly that's where we can determine what areas we are going to be able to do these risk assessments on. We can look at the information obtained from all levels of management, and that can help us in determining where are the high risk areas. Again, back to priorities. What should we look at first? Now, how the individual audit is related to the overall organization should also be considered, as well as its linkage to the business plans. Your audit objectives refer to the specific goals that must be accomplished during the audit as a part of the plan. Basically, your goal, the objective, is to audit, let's say, this control. Then that is your goal, and that's what you should finish or accomplish to successfully complete the audit. So you might have an objective to maybe on substantiating that internal controls exist, to minimize business risks, and to make sure that those controls are functioning as required. One of the key elements in planning the audit objective is to translate your basic and wide range objectives into specific audit objectives. How else can we say, that was pretty wide range, say as an example, that you're making sure your internal controls exist to minimize business risks. Well, that's not actually even very specific, right? It's a very wide range objective as far as, the overall number of controls we might be looking at. But our goal is to try to figure out how we can get that into the specific audit objective, which is, are they functioning as required in minimizing business risk? As an auditor, you should have an understanding of how the general objectives can be translated into a specific control objective. Again, if they're looking at that wide-ranging idea, to make sure that we have all these controls working to meet the reduction of risk, well, now I have to say, okay, which control? Look at each one of them and translate the objectives of the audit to what I'm going to use as my objective for this specific control, knowing that that objective for that specific control leads to the overall objective being accomplished. It is an important process that you have to go through in planning your IS audit. We can look at compliance versus substantive testing in the following way. Compliance testing is you're gathering evidence to basically test to see if the organization is in compliance with a control procedure. Now that's different than substantive testing, where the evidence is used to evaluate the integrity of transactions data or other information. One way of looking at it is if you're doing compliance testing and you find that the control is in compliance, then you should feel pretty confident that you've got your risks at a minimum, at least within the goals of the organization. But if you notice that the control itself is not as compliant, meaning it's got some risks that you don't want, now you got to understand, okay, well, there are some things in here that make this control not as compliant, but did that lack of control affect the actual information? That's where the substantive testing can come in, to look at and evaluate the integrity of the transactions data and other information to see if they've been negatively influenced by the weaknesses found in some other control. So as I said, the compliance test is to determine if controls are being applied in compliance with the manager's policies and procedures. Remember, the goal for us is to understand the objective of the compliance test and of the control being tested. And if I again compare that to substantive tests, where all we're looking at is the integrity of the processing being evaluated rather than the compliance, you can almost see that they can go hand in hand, because it's, even if I have a control that's in compliance, I may still want to test to make sure that the information has maintained its integrity. So wrapping this all up, compliance and substantive testing can work together. Now, if a control is found to be in compliance, that can help reduce the need for the substantive testing, because if it's in compliance, we should have a greater confidence of the integrity of the information. But on the other hand, as I said, if the control shows a weakness, then you can use the substantive test to help reduce the doubts about the accuracy and validity of the information that was being audited. In the discussion of evidence, we first start off by saying that it's information that we use as an auditor to determine whether the entity or the data has met some of the established criteria or objectives, and whether or not it supports the conclusions of the audit. In fact, we have to have evidence, because I just don't want to go in there and say, here's my report and it says you're fine. I want to be able to supply evidence. Now, the sources of evidence could simply be from the auditor's observations, notes from interviews with management to get their assertions, to interviews with people in the IS departments, information from the correspondence or other documentation that they might have. Could be correspondence with a vendor that supplied you with the control that you're purchasing. And of course, you should have an audit test and the results of that audit test to also use to further the evidence to support your conclusions. Now, we have to make sure that the evidence is reliable. That means we need to show independence of the evidence provider. That might mean the auditor itself. Because if I can be shown that I have a bias, whether it's a bias because I feel the pressure of management, it's going to get rid of my job if I give them a bad report, if it's bias because of illegal activities, briberies, those types of things, then you can't trust the evidence and shouldn't use it to support any conclusions. So we need to show independence of the evidence provider or the auditor. And of course, I also want to know what are the qualifications of the person that is providing the evidence. If I've got a person providing evidence about a certain vendor firewall, I got to ask, do they know what they're talking about? Have they worked with this vendor before? Do they understand firewall technologies? Or is this a person who more works on Windows operating systems and they understand the ins and outs of Windows, but really aren't working on the infrastructure support or the security support? Qualifications. Because the more qualified you are, the more I'm going to believe the evidence. It's kind of like if you've ever watched any courtroom dramas. They talk about bringing the expert witness up there. Because the evidence from an expert witness, we call them an expert because we believe in their qualifications and we hold that evidence to a higher value than if it was Ken coming in with whatever story I may have made up. All right, the objectivity of the evidence as well, and the timing of the evidence, looking at when was the evidence gathered as a part of the whole testing procedure as well. But those are things that we look at to make sure that we can rely on the evidence to draw our conclusions and our recommendations in our final reports. Now, you can gather evidence from a lot of different locations. I've mentioned some already. It could be just you're doing some reviews of the organizational structure, of policies and procedures, of standards and documentation. In fact, those are all good sources of information and evidence, and should be information you've already gathered as a part of understanding the goals of the organization as it's aligned with what you're auditing, to make sure that you've got that compliance, that they're integrated together. Personnel interviews, of course, observations of the processes, watching the employees, performing their duties, maybe having them re-perform some of it for you so you can watch their understanding of procedures and what they're doing is basically be able to compare that to your policies and procedures, because that would be evidential. Either they're following the procedures, they're not following procedures, or they're not following procedures, interview them, find out why. Doing walkthroughs, yourself. Can I follow these procedures and walk through and do the performance that's expected of me? These are all good places to get evidence. When we talk about interviewing and observing the people that are watching, these are techniques that help you to identify the actual functions of what people do, the actual processes or procedures. If I have a procedure that says, I'll make it easy, this is how you send an email, right? You open up your email client, you click, you follow those procedures, and you watch the person doing this, and you say, okay, you're not following the procedures that I read. Why is that? And you say, well, those procedures were written 2 years ago. We've had 4 upgrades to the email client, and those buttons don't exist anymore. Those are techniques that help you identify, the information that you need, right? The actual functions, watching how it actually works, watching the processes, the procedures, testing the security awareness, of course, of the people involved, and reporting relationships that are there. All of this is just part of, like I said, gathering information as a good auditor to be able to help get the evidence that you need to be able to do the proper evaluation of the controls. We mentioned the use of sampling, and we talked about it with the risk of auditing. Because as we said, there are possibilities that we can make errors or miss errors when we're doing the auditing. One of them was in the sampling. Now remember, sampling is what we do when it would be too expensive or time consuming for us to go through all transactions of the events being audited, because there may be millions or hundreds of millions. Some of the methods of sampling could be a statistical sampling, which would utilize your mathematical laws of probability. You could use the non-statistical sampling, sometimes called a judgmental sampling, and that's based on the auditor's judgment to determine what method of sampling, how many items they want to look at, and which items they want to select. They might make these decisions because they may be very familiar with the process, and they may understand that certain parts of a process, maybe because of their complexity, are more prone to having issues. And so rather than doing a statistical sample and miss a specific type of event that I want to audit, I might, because of my judgment, say, you know what? I need to audit this particular bit of information because I know that it's tricky. I know that there's problems with it, and I need to, and so that's the judgment call going in to look at what wants to be examined, what items I'm going to select. Another type of sampling is called the variable sampling. And it's a type of sampling that looks up population characteristics that have variance. And these could include items that are monetary values or weights, attributes as an example. One of them, in fact, is the attribute sampling, which is the occurrence or the rate that a certain attribute does exist. So you might want to look at like a computer access form and look for the attribute of a signature being at the bottom of each one of those authorization forms. And so that's the attribute you're looking at of the sample of that you were looking at, the forms. Stop and go sampling, I use an example of verifying a new recording file. So you got this file that's maybe audio, video, and you want to make sure that everything appears to be good, sound quality and the rest, without actually listening to the entire sample or the entire object. You might start at the beginning, go for a set time, stop, move to another part of the sampling, and the idea is if it sounds good at all of these different locations, then the assumption is that stuff we didn't sample would also be good. And on the discovery sampling, that's where you might be actually looking for a specific object or a specific bit of information, usually in a fraud or irregular activities. So if I looked at it and I said, well, that guy Ken, he's got some really weird irregular stuff going on, and I'm not sure, it's kind of different, maybe even fraudulent. So I could say, let's go and take and discover all of the things that Ken was involved in and sample those, right? Very specific into the discovery. Now, when it comes to the variable sampling, there are some different types of sampling you can do of a quantitative type. One is the stratified mean per unit, where you can actually break the information down into different groups and look at them individually as groups. The unstratified mean would be to look at the average mean for all of them. And the difference estimation is, of course, knowing what some of the expectations are, what the actual values are, and having, again, those guesses at the differences. Now, variable sampling, we have to remember, we're not looking at all of the information, probably because it's too overwhelming. So we have to have what's called a confidence coefficient, which is a percentage value. If I could look at the entire array of information, my confidence coefficient would be near 100%. But if depending on the type of sampling I'm doing and the information I'm looking at, I can still give you a a coefficient. I can put you in the 90%, 95% confidence rating. Then you understand that there is a level of risk that I may have missed something. And so that's what we're basically trying to say is here's to the precision that I feel confident, the precision of the information that I've audited. I expect that there are going to be error rates because I didn't look at all of the information. So I have to, first of all, have an error rate that I'm comfortable with. From there, you can have the sample mean, the sample standard deviation, tolerable error rate. So I might have an expected error rate. And as I'm looking through the samples and I'm going, doing my evaluations, my error rate might be higher than I expected, but at some point it's still tolerable. It's within, again, the standard that I have, at least an average. And if my error rate, as I'm doing the sample, becomes higher than I want, higher than it's tolerable, then that means I probably have to change the way in which I'm doing the samples. So again, things to think about as far as what we're trying to provide. And if you really think about it, it almost comes down to a comfort level when it comes to how much I'm willing to risk, the precision, my expected error rates, my tolerable error rates, my confidence coefficient, and that's a part of what we consider as we're doing these variable samplings. In today's world, we may have to use other auditors and experts to help us in the conclusion of the audit that we're doing. Now, this can be dependent on the availability of the auditors that I have or the need of subject matter experts that I might not have on my staff to be able to assist in the auditing. I may even have to outsource to other auditors or experts, but it's important to remember that the goal is to make sure I have the appropriate resources available for the audit and that the people doing the audits are knowledgeable in the areas in which they've been assigned. And that may mean that you have to go out to get the services of other auditors. Now, prior to engaging these outside resources, you need to make sure that you cover things like the restrictions of outsourcing based on the current laws and regulations that you have to follow. Whatever contractual stipulations you might have to allow you to bring these outsiders in. Do they cause an impact to the audit objectives? Would the inclusion of outsiders add additional audit risk or more liability? Remembering that ultimately the liability relies on you when you were chartered for the original audit. You need to make sure you look at the independence and objectivity of the outside resource. Now, that's an important thing because let's say there's a specific technology. I'm not going to pick any vendor for you, but it's very complex and maybe it's so complex that it's hardly used, or there's a limited number of people who are capable of really understanding this bit of equipment or control. If I hire somebody from the vendor who made the control to do the audit, they might not be so objective if they know that their product has some flaws and they don't want to tell us about, right? So you make sure you have the independence and objectivity of whoever that outside resource is, and that they have the competence, the qualifications, and experience to be able to perform the audit, and also make sure you have good methods of communication. The auditor needs to remember that the use of an outside resource is not going to reduce their liability. I can't say, oh, they did it. They're the ones that made the mistake. You hired them. You brought them in. So you are liable for their conclusions. That means you need to communicate the objectives, the scope, and the methodology. Make sure there is a monitoring process of regular reviews with the outside work that's being done, and also look at the usefulness of the results that are being provided to you by the external resource. Another part of auditing is the use of computer-assisted audit techniques, CAAT, and I'm just going to call it CAT, or CATs for plural. And CATs are important tools that, as an auditor, you need to use to gather information in this IS environment. By today's standards, you're almost always going to need some sort of software tool to gather and analyze information. And the CATs do that. They can help you gather information independently. Now, when I say CATs, that's not a software, but a collection of software that would fall under audit techniques. And that means that they represent a variety of tools and techniques. One example is what we call GAS, the Generalized Audit Software. Now, when we talk about GAS, it refers to some standard software that can directly read and access data from a variety of different database platforms. It has the functions to be able to get to file access, file reorganization, data selection. It can provide statistical functions, different types of mathematical functions for us. But again, it's a tool that was designed specifically for the auditing of databases. As an auditor, you should review the evidences gathered during the audit to determine that the operations reviewed were well controlled and effective. That also means that as an auditor, you should have sufficient judgment and experience to be able to make those types of determinations. Now, one of the things you might use in making those determinations is what's called a control matrix, and it can help assess the proper level of controls. So if you think of a chart with two axes, what you can say is that the known types of errors are placed at the top axis, and the known controls for detection or correction are placed on the side axis, and then you can just kind of chart the control matrix to be able to say, these types of errors go with these types of controls, and to be able to start mapping that out as well. As we continue to talk about audit strengths and weaknesses, you need to remember that in some instances, one strong control might be able to compensate for a weak control in another area. You also may look at having overlapping controls as being considered as two strong controls. Normally, the control objective is not achieved by considering one control adequate. Instead, you should be looking at and should perform tests to evaluate how one control might relate to other controls. So generally, a group of controls, when you aggregate them together, can act as a compensating control and minimize risk. Now let me put all that into perspective for you with the example of a firewall and an intrusion detection system. So you might decide that you look at a firewall and you say, okay, here's what the control does. It's doing its job well. It looks at IP addresses and transport layer protocols and makes a decision about permitting or denying that traffic to come through. And so it seems to be a very good control in that area. But it's kind of weak in that people can still send buffer overflows through the firewall because all the firewall is looking at is the IP addresses and the transport protocol and not looking into the data. So we might have another compensating control like an intrusion detection system that can then look at the information that comes out of the firewall and evaluate the same information only for a different type of attack, buffer overflows, malware, that sort of stuff. And together, they are working together to be able to give you a better sense of security. And that's where you consider them overlapping because they're looking at the same packets that are going through the network. And again, one control objective might not have been adequate by itself, but together, when aggregated together, they can act as a very good compensating control to really minimize risk. We also need to judge the materiality of findings. Now, materiality is a key issue when the auditor is deciding what findings to bring forward. It'll also depend on what is significant to the different levels of management as well, as far as what they want to, what they're basically, I guess you could say, is what they're in charge of. Now, you have to use your judgment to decide which findings you're going to present to the different levels of management. But at some point, it's important that all of the findings are included in your reports so that it's available, especially at the very top end of the management at the CEO level or CIO level, so that they have full knowledge of the findings. But when it comes to the different areas of management, they may have different areas of concern, and so what's material to them is different than another group. So that's kind of the idea again, is how do you judge that materiality of findings? And it really almost is a matter of perspective as well. When you're done with the audit, you need to do exit interviews. You have to be able to talk about the results. And on the exit interviews, that's where you're going to make sure you get all the facts in the report, make sure everything's correct, make sure the recommendations that you're going to give them as a result of the reports, that they're realistic and cost effective, and maybe even make recommendations as far as when these changes should be implemented, by at least what date would be appropriate. And that's communicating the results of your audit, the very work that you're being paid for, that you need to present as the end package. Now, the presentation and techniques that you use could be what we might call an executive summary. Often that's a very good summary for communicating the ideas of the results without getting into all of the detail that your target audience might not have specific knowledge about or understand what you're saying. You may also consider some visual presentations as well. I like to talk about the PowerPoint rangers, people who can make these really cool slides and make things move and animate. And okay, so those types of options. The auditor should discuss the findings of the audit with the management staff prior to talking to the senior management. And maybe it's just considered as a courtesy or reporting chain, but it's important to let management know your results so that they can, basically have an understanding, or maybe they might disagree with you. That's not uncommon, but at least they have the opportunity to be able to maybe present their own rebuttal. But it's at least as a courtesy, you're kind of going to go up the chain. But the big hope is not to get the rebuttal, but to have these meetings to get agreements on the findings and to use management to help you find a corrective action and to come up with corrective actions that you can then take that and actually use it before the final report as a part of your recommendations. Now, the audit report structure should have an introduction to the report that includes the overall audit objectives and whatever the appropriate limitations were. You should then have your audit findings done in separate sections, finishing with an overall conclusion and opinions. You should make sure that you put the qualifications of all the auditors as they apply to the audit areas, and at the end have the audit findings and recommendations. Now remember that auditing is an ongoing process, and after the report has been submitted, you should have follow-up to determine if the appropriate corrective actions have been taken. Now, depending on the level of follow-up, an auditor may have to do yet another follow-up audit to check on the status following the recommendations having been implemented. Now, on the audit documentation, the minimum things that should be included with the audit documents are things like the planning and preparation of the audit scope and objectives, because that's kind of the guideline that's going to explain the rest of the report. You should have the descriptions or walkthroughs on the scope of the audit area as part of the documentation. Your audit program, the audit steps that you performed, the evidence gathered. Now, in a way, this is basically keeping a log of all of your activities, every single step you did, so that you can, number one, if you did a good enough documentation, somebody can read it and follow the same steps and hopefully come up with the same conclusions. Any services or other auditors or experts outsourcing that you might have used. You should have all of the findings of your audit, the conclusions and recommendations with the documentation, and include, of course, the relevant identification and dates, or I should say the audit documentation with relation to the document dates and identification of that document should all be a part of what you submit. Basically, what is it called? When, how do I identify it? How do I name it, label it? When did it occur? We're going to take a look at control self-assessment in this lesson. And the definition is really kind of a management technique to be able to assure the stakeholders that the internal control systems of an organization are reliable. Well, how do they do that? They do it by having a methodology that allows them to review the key business objectives, the risks involved with those objectives, and the internal controls that are used to manage those risks. And it's kind of an ongoing evaluation, as though you could almost say that the internal employees were doing their own constant audit of the internal controls to make sure that they are safe, secure, and meeting the objectives. And because it's an ongoing type of monitoring or assessment, that's what kind of brings the extra confidence to the stakeholders that the organization is doing everything it can to be reliable. So the CSA, what we call the control self-assessment, and I did promise you all sorts of acronyms. So the CSA, it's kind of a collection of tools that are, like I said, to use to gather information. It could be something as simple as a questionnaire up to a fully facilitated workshop where you are basically having this group discussion with the people involved in the day-to-day operations of these controls. It also is an ongoing interviews of how it's working day to day. Based on the people's knowledge of the area. The basic tools for CSA are going to be the same whether the project that you're working on is a technical one or a financial one or an operational one, because again we're having kind of that overview discussion of the term control And as we know, a control is not just a piece of hardware. It's not just a piece of software. There's no one thing a control is other than something we use to mitigate the risk, protecting our assets from any type of hazard that's out there. So you can utilize this, I guess you could say you could utilize this type of control self-assessment regardless of the type of project you're working on. Now, if you choose to use one of those facilitator workshops, you need to make sure that the people you have running those workshops have good listening skills and the ability to ask questions, because it's not designed necessarily to be a presentation where I'm telling you how it's going to be, but it's an interactive workshop, because I mean, that's the term. It's not a classroom. It's a workshop where we're making discussions, we're talking about the controls, we're talking about the issues, we're talking about the risks, we're listening, we're asking questions, because we're trying to come up with a good consensus and a good way of improving the aspects of how the control works. The facilitator should have good verbal communication skills. They should be able to work with group dynamics, because sometimes in workshops some stronger opinions can lead to stronger opinions, and so you got to work with the dynamics. You should be able to resolve, whoever the facilitator is, be able to resolve complex situations. And the facilitator should be also good at time management, staying on the schedule, because again, sometimes it's too easy to take a little side street in these discussions, and before you know it, you're lost. You didn't stay on the topic at hand, staying on the schedules. And so those are our key points that you look for in having whoever it is you pick to be the facilitator. Now, notice this is not the auditor. Now, a lot of what we're talking about, though, could be passed off as an audit, because a lot of these control self-assessments we've talked about may very well mimic the types of procedures that a person would go through in auditing that control. So the primary objective for the CSA is to leverage the internal audit function by shifting some of the monitoring responsibilities to the actual functional areas. Now, this is not to say we're replacing the auditor, but that we are doing something, as I said, can be very much taken as an ongoing audit. Now, the goal of CSA should be to educate management about the control design and monitoring. And again, that's one of the objectives, is to be able to gather that information and to make those recommendations. The objectives should be or should outline the acceptable control environments. Through the use of workshops, you'll gain the empowerment of workers to assess or even design the control environment. In other words, giving them the feeling of ownership, if not the actual ownership, of making sure the process is working, that the control is working the way it's supposed to be, that they feel as though they have input to the actual design of the control environment. There should be at least a generic set of goals and metrics for each process that can be used in designing the CSA program. And again, if it's something you use as simple as a sheet, well, I need to not just give you a blank sheet and say, tell me what you think, but I should have some goals, some metrics that provide the ability for the assessment of the control. By using the CSA, you have some potentially good benefits. Those can be, of course, early detections of risks, because now you have people involved in watching and monitoring these controls, and they may be able to show you evidence of potential risks. So you have early detection. You should get more effective internal controls, hopefully a more cohesive team. And by developing that sense of ownership of the controls, maybe you can get better motivation from the people that are working with it. If anything, you at least are increasing employee awareness of the organizational objectives as well as the risks they should be looking for. Hopefully, it gives you better communication between operations and the upper management. More motivated employees, as I said, improved audit ratings because you have this ongoing monitoring, reduction in the control cost, and more importantly for the stakeholders, more assurances for them and as well as the customers you support. Unfortunately, as with most ideas, there are disadvantages, and they exist as well with the control self-assessment. Some of them is, as I've already mentioned before, that it could be mistaken as an audit function replacement, and it certainly is not. Some people might think of this as more work that they have to do, filling out forms, going to meetings, and they may, cause them to, with that negative morale, to fail to act on improvements, and again, it could just damage morale. And if you have a lack of motivation, it can limit the effectiveness in your ability to actually detect a weak control. Now, auditors are still needed regardless of whether or not you have the control self-assessment. And in fact, they should be considered an enhanced part of the control self-assessment because if you already have a CSA program in there, then they're able to utilize that information in the course of their audit and to be able to hopefully get maybe a bigger picture of the overall effectiveness and the business objectives. So when you have those programs established, the auditor pretty much become internal control professionals and assessment facilitators. Again, that's back to facilitating those workshops. Now, an auditor value can be considered of more importance by management, especially if they can make recommendations on that ongoing CSA process. So again, right, not only is it the CSA doing kind of the role of auditing the control, but now we can audit that CSA process to make that a better function of monitoring the control. It is important, though, that the auditors still understand the business processes that are being evaluated. And remember, the auditor could lead or facilitate having the auditees involved in the assessing of their environment. Making that even easier to think of, I can basically recruit these people to say, this is what I need to help me in auditing your environment. Can you help by gathering and assessing this information? Now, a CSA program should develop techniques for empowering information gathering and decision making by its participants. In fact, I think it's a very important statement to start off with just the word empowering. By empowerment, you're giving them the ability to put in the feedback to really be able to help improve the process. If you don't give them that kind of feedback, then the work of information gathering becomes that negative aspect where it's just like extra work, busy work, that workload, and you demotivate them from helping participate in making improvements to these controls. So it's important that they are part of the decision-making process, and in fact it could be even a group decision-making process, which you need to have because that is an essential component, especially on a workshop-based CSA. If they don't have, or if the work that they do and the information they gather and the opinions and recommendations they make don't seem to be, looked at or even wanted by the upper management that was putting this process together, that's where you could see that negative influence on the morale. Now, when we look at the traditional method of analyzing and reporting versus the CSA approach, you'll notice that traditionally the primary responsibility for the analyzing and reporting was given to the auditors and to a lesser extent the control departments and outside consultants that might come in to help carry that load. With the CSA approach, we're emphasizing management and accountability over the development and monitoring of internal controls. As I said, we're giving that to the people that are working with them in those areas and making them an active part of the process of the assessment and the auditing. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the evolving IS audit process, which is something we realize has to continually change to be able to keep up with the changes in technologies. One of the things we see is what we call automated work papers. Now, more and more auditors are relying on automation to be able to create the reports, risk analysis, audit programs, the results, testing evidence, etc., things that we've talked about. And it's especially true when you think about the vast amount of information that an auditor probably has to go through. We need this kind of automated format to be able to help. Just remember, don't solely rely on the automation. The results of those should still be checked for factual correctness to make sure that it basically is getting the right information for you and producing quality evidence. Now, there are a lot of automation packages that can be used. It could be something as easy as a word processor, spreadsheets. Standard audit work paper packages are being implemented for the medium to large departments to make this function of auditing a lot easier. And these can be helpful to be able to facilitate audit work. You could almost, and I've used this term before, think of it as kind of a cookie cutter approach, but I think it builds a great foundation of helping me remember this is what we need, and we can certainly add to it, we can supplement it, and we don't have to just solely rely on that type of automation. We can add to it, and it, I think, builds a good framework for getting a good audit. Now, as an auditor, you have to be concerned with the what I call the CIA, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the audit records. And you should have some at least minimum controls to be addressed for security reasons of protecting this information. Now, notice what I'm saying. It's your information that we need to make sure is safe. That means you should have controls that guard access to the work papers, controlling the audit trails, including when a document was changed and who changed it. Very important, I think, as far as keeping track of the updates to the overall audit. Automating features to revive record approvals, we call that a job approval. And what that basically means is that if I do make a change to a document, rather than that being set in stone, there should be a review process to look at those documents to make sure that it looks right. So again, a job approval. The necessary security and integrity controls, maybe encryption, that type of thing. Certainly backup and restore procedures so you don't lose the information through a hard drive crash or theft or something like that. And as I already mentioned, encryption techniques to try to keep that information secure so that if you did have a theft, let's say of the laptop you were using or the hard drive, the files would still be useless to the people who have them. Another thing we look at is what's called integrated auditing. Now this is a process where the different audit disciplines are combined together to assess key internal controls over an operation, a process, or an entity. You could think of it this way, that in today's world with the high reliance of IT, the folks that might be doing a financial audit realize that they need to understand what's happening on the infrastructure controls that is protecting access to their information. That's a part of what they need to do. And likewise, when we're doing the IT/IS audit, we need to understand the business processes like the financial part that can be affected by having controls that are not up to the date, up to speed, or adequate for the job. And so we need to kind of integrate these two areas together because they have some overlap where they can affect each other. So the integrated approach's job is to focus on risk. Now you need risk analysis assessments to identify what risks are arising from the entity and its environment as they pertain to internal controls. So if I'm doing a financial audit, I need to understand about the controls used in the network environment that provide access and communication to the servers that may be containing this financial information. Now at this point, the auditor should understand and identify the risks in the areas that they are auditing, and a key element of the integrated approach then is to discuss these risks among all of those audit teams together. The integrated process typically involves the identification of risks that are faced by the area being audited. It should also have the identification of relevant key controls. There should be a review and understanding of those key controls, methods of performing tests on those controls, testing that the management controls are working efficiently also. Remember, management can be a series of policies and procedures and guidelines, and there should be a combined report or opinion on control risks, designs, and weaknesses. So again, combined because we've integrated the auditing process of these different areas. Integrated auditing has changed a lot of the ways in which stakeholders look at the audit process. It basically gives them a better feeling because those being audited have a better understanding of the objectives as you're able to see the linkage between controls and the audit process. And at the same time, it should also help management see and have the same understanding of this overall process. We can also consider the use of continuous auditing. Now, there have been many studies and examinations concerning continuous auditing as opposed to the more traditional periodic audit reviews, especially when you consider that some of those times in between the audits are on a yearly basis. Now, there's a lot of motivation for continuous auditing, including monitoring, let's say, of financial issues of the company, ensuring the real-time transactions are safe, and they can also benefit from the real-time monitoring as well, especially when we're talking about looking for signs of anomalies or of failures or something else that could affect negatively the impact of that process. Now, there is a distinction between continuous auditing and continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring will involve tools that are based on an automated procedure to meet the fiduciary responsibilities. That's a fancy term. All right, automated procedure. Let's think of one. Antivirus software. You download a file from the internet, you get an email, that automatically scans those documents to look for signs of malware. And it does it without any prompting. It's just designed to continually monitor. And what that does, that automation procedure, then is trying to safeguard, as a control even, it's trying to safeguard your assets, and that's hopefully meeting the responsibilities that you have. As a continuous auditing, that's kind of a methodology that allows the independent auditors to provide written assurances on a subject matter, and they can contain the results of the continuous monitoring as a part of their auditing process. With both continuous monitoring and auditing taking place, you get what we can call continuous assurance, and that's something good to have established. Continuous auditing tries to create a more secure platform to be able to avoid fraud, especially if people know that there is an ongoing auditing process. It's meant, in some ways, as a discouragement against fraud. It's also designed to help avoid, any real-time processes aimed at the high level of financial control. And that's an important part of this, right? Is we want to be able to know that we can try to avoid fraud or aim the continuous auditing at these really important processes so that we are constantly able to monitor, notice back and forth, right? But to be able to assess how these controls are working. Some prerequisites exist for continuous auditing. They should include things like putting it on whenever there's a high degree of automation. All right, so in other words, continuous auditing is not something we're going to do on a control that may be very rarely used, but if it's or may have a lot of manual intervention. But if it has a high degree of automation, continuous auditing is good because it allows us, think about it, if it's got a lot of automation, that means not a lot of hands-on. And so without a lot of hands-on, you don't have people looking at it all the time. And so now by continuously auditing it, we can go and look at the logs and observe the processes and look for signs of problems. When there's an automated and highly reliable process and producing information soon after or during the occurrence is another time when we should put in continuous auditing. And that might be considered as parts of credit card processing, right? Because as soon as I'm going through that process, it's producing information, it's doing it during the occurrence, it's pulling bank funds and those types of things. You may also consider, whenever doing the continuous auditing, whenever an alarm triggers, so that it, you can report control failures. So that's important, right? If I'm watching this process, I've got continuous auditing on and alarm triggers, then we can look at that. It also helps us in being able to quickly inform IS auditors of the results of the automated procedures, especially when an alarm is raised or an anomaly is detected. What does that mean? Again, because auditing was already on. Remember, this is something that is on when the event occurs, when the alarm triggers, when an alarm is raised, when the anomaly is detected. Because we have the continuous auditing on, it allows us the ability to be able to look at that information and to see the results of what was going on with that procedure. You can think of it as having those closed circuit TV cameras guarding, your front door. And, if you have it on, it's continuously, you could say, monitoring or auditing that front door. And if somebody breaks in, hopefully you've got them on video. But it's a little too late to turn it on after the fact. So that's kind of the idea of this continuous auditing. IS techniques that are used in continuous auditing should work at a variety of data levels, which could include things like transaction logging. Now, transaction logging, that, is, when you think of the definition of transaction, it means that a series of events have to happen 100% or they're all rolled back, nothing happens at all. That's a typical operation of a database function. Could be a financial type of function. It could be another time when you use this is with query tools or statistic and data analysis, database management systems, data warehouses, neural network technology, accessible business reporting languages are areas where you might consider using the continuous auditing. Well, the goal of this chapter was to talk about the domain processing of auditing information systems. And as you saw, we talked about the whole set of processes that are involved with the entire auditing process. We talked about the entire practice, including the procedures, having a thorough methodology that you can use to perform the audits on any given area of IT, doing it in a professional manner, so long, of course, that you have the necessary knowledge to be able to provide those particular services. Our goal was to make sure we understood the sections like how to develop and implement a risk-based IT audit strategy, one that's in compliance with your current IT audit standards to cover all the key areas, to be able to plan for specific audits to determine whether information systems are protected, controlled, to be able to provide a value with the results of the audit to the organization. To know how to conduct audits that are in accordance with your IT audit standards and to achieve those planned objectives, and creating the reports and the findings, utilizing the evidence to support your reports, to make recommendations to the key stakeholders, and even have the ability to do follow-ups, maybe even follow-up audits, the creation of status reports to make sure all the appropriate actions were taken by management and also in a timely manner. And that was kind of the goal, is to talk about that entire audit process from that start to the end, which is from when you first get the statement of work, the objectives, making the plans, all the way to doing the reports.